Good evening. I'd like to call our special council budget meeting on Tuesday, March 7th to order at 6 p.m. Good evening to councillor colleagues here in the chamber. Good evening to staff in attendance, and good evening to members of the public who may be watching the live webcast this evening or watching a recording of the meeting at a later date. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we are having our meeting this evening in the territory of the Wasanish Nations. This is their traditional and ancestral lands, and we are grateful for the stewardship of these lands that they have shown for millennia. In turning to approval of the agenda, we have one item of correspondence received since the agenda was published last Thursday. That is a letter of correspondence from Mr. Eric Diller, and so that will be, with approval of the agenda, that will be received. And I would look for a motion to approve as amended, please.
So moved. Second.
All in favor? None are opposed. That motion carries. Thank you. And we'll turn to our special public participation period, which is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to any member of the any matter regarding our budget this evening. I'm not seeing any members of the public in attendance this evening, and we don't have any members of the public registered to speak online. And so I will open and close public participation and move to our main business this evening, which is item 5A under staff reports, which is our budget and our 2023 to 2027 budget. And this item is being brought forward from the regular council meeting of February 27th. And I will turn it to Mr. Hissick for a presentation this evening. Mr. Hissick, could you provide council perhaps and those who may be watching online a brief estimate of the length of your presentation, or will it be a bit of presentation and back and forth with council?
It's intended to be a back and forth. There will be, well, I'll outline that near the beginning, but the intention is that it's somewhat iterative, and it's not going to be just me talking and then questions. So I'll hopefully make that clear as I go.
Thank you.
Thank you, members of council, and any public who may be watching this budget meeting at a later time. First of all, I want to give a shout out to the wonderful management team we have who helped put this budget together. I'm the one standing up here fielding the questions, but this is an incredible group of dedicated people who the town is very lucky to have. They're experienced, they're dedicated, and they always give their all for the town. They always give their best advice, and they make my job easier. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So I'm not going to rehash everything I presented last time. I'm going to provide a brief recap of where we stand, a bit of additional information that's come forward since the initial budget meeting, and then it'll be our chance to give first consideration to the budget by area. And it'll be a little bit of a change from what we're used to in terms of the order, but we're going to tackle every aspect of the budget following the budget binder for the first time. And there's also a lengthy staff report that hopefully added context to council's review, and that is open for discussion at any time when we talk about that particular topic.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. I meant to indicate in my introduction that as members of the public may know, if there are members watching, that we do have another budget meeting scheduled 2 weeks from this evening, if that is required. Sorry?
1 week.
1 week from today, sorry.
A special Tuesday night meeting, just like tonight.
Thank you.
Very quick recap of where we are in the three-stage process. We are at meeting 2, which is essentially the first opportunity for council to discuss different aspects of the budget. Now that you've had a good long time to review the binder, ask additional questions, consider the staff report, and all the other information that's come forward since it was presented back on the 6th, over a month ago now. It's the first opportunity for the public to weigh in as well. We have received some correspondence along the way, including one tonight. There is a staff report on the agenda, and we hope to conclude proceedings next Tuesday night at a special meeting, and any changes that are approved tonight will be brought forward as part of a revised budget for next Tuesday, with the goal next week being to complete the process. So as we all know by now, we went in with a proposed general tax increase of 4.93%, and that includes several new budget items that are being brought forward in terms of supplemental items primarily. And all of these are subject to council approval, so if any of them are rejected, then obviously the overall increase will be reduced. And conversely, if any new items are added by council, that could impact the tax increase. You saw this slide last time. I always like to point out where we stand in relation to inflation. So we have come in a full 2% under the inflation factor for Victoria for last year. So I think that's a great starting point, and we got there primarily because of growth in the tax base that allowed us to essentially cover that 2% and a little bit more. And you know how I feel about CPI being some kind of glass ceiling to what we're trying to achieve here. It's an artificial ceiling for consideration of municipal services because we're not considering the same basket of goods every year, and it's not the same basket that's measured by the inflation factor. Quick recap, there will be a few slides that are repeats from last time, so I'll just gloss over them, but it's good to have these resources together for council and the community's consideration. So how do we develop the budget? It comes through council requests all year, community requests that are brought forward either directly to staff or through council, and also many staff initiatives based on all those inputs as well as our own. We always stay abreast of best practices, current trends in our respective fields, and we bring forward whatever we think is of benefit to the town. So it's the best judgment of this great management team that bring forward new budget items, and also the impacts of existing service levels and existing budget levels on budget items, I should say, on our costs. So we don't automatically apply an inflation factor. We start from essentially the previous year's budget and only inflate in those areas where absolutely necessary, whether it be negotiated personnel impacts, contract costs that are outside or sometimes only partly within our control. And general inflation sometimes does impact us because certainly we're heavily dependent on fuel prices and energy prices. So there are always a few nice-to-have items. Not everything is a must-have, but nice-to-have items are important to bring forward for consideration because what one person considers nice to have is essential to another. We tend not to bring forward frivolous items. And a quick recap of how we fund our overall budget. There is an element of surplus funding which is meant to reduce the tax impact each year. So we're required to have an ongoing surplus from operations, but in any given year we can budget for a deficit, and we do that by using some surplus funding to balance the budget and reduce the tax requirement. Taxes make up 65% of our operating revenues. So it's a very large chunk of how we fund our operations. So just to illustrate how we use surplus and what I mean by that, here's how we achieve a balanced budget for the year. So there's our general operating expenditures of just over $21 million for the year. So the first thing we do is we take all of our other revenues, our user fees, service charges, certain grants that we get every year, that reduces the net impact of our operating costs by about 6.7 million. And over and above that, we would normally be balancing the rest of it by raising enough tax revenues to cover the difference between the general operating cost and the fees and charges. However, we have a couple of mitigating measures that we use. First of all, we have a little bit of the Safe Restart funding left over from 2020, and we're using virtually all of it this year to help phase back to full revenue levels. And next year we'll have a tiny chunk remaining to do likewise. So you'll see in this illustration that after applying those three revenue sources, there's still a small gap in balancing our budget. So that's where surplus comes in. We add that little bit of extra from prior year surplus to bring it to a balanced state. So the 21,342 in 21 million, I should say, in costs is now fully funded through those four sources. So taxation is, once everything else has been exhausted, we have to raise enough revenues to pay for our operations. And that tax increase, as you know, is partially mitigated by new revenues through a growth in the tax base. And last year we had a fairly large, probably our largest growth in the tax base that we've had for a number of years, primarily due to commercial developments on the west side. So the general changes and assessments are factored out when we set our rates, which will be coming up following budget approval. And there are different rates paid by various classes of property. And you know that last year there was a property tax distribution policy that was approved by council following several attempts, with the goal of bridging the gap between rates paid by residential and commercial properties. So council directed that this new policy be phased in over a 10-year period. So each and every year, residential will be taking on a slightly greater proportion of the tax burden to the benefit of the commercial tax base. So this is the first year of those 10 years, and there will be a slight impact on how that 4.93% general tax increase is allocated. Essentially, we're still looking right now at the 4.93% as a general tax increase, but without any further intervention in reducing that impact, we're looking at 5.24% for residential and roughly 4.08% for commercial. It's more difficult to come up with a precise number for commercial because it's such a varied base, but 4.08 is a pretty good estimate. So just to let council know that if there's a desire to get the residential impact closer to the published 4.93%, we would need to reduce the tax impact by just under $50,000 to get it close to that number. So cutting exactly 50 from the tax impact would bring the residential increase to 4.86%. So Safe Restart grants, I've mentioned those briefly. We got a fairly hefty contribution from senior governments to help with the impacts of COVID, and that allowed us initially to bring our tax increase for 2020 down to 0 and cut commercial taxes by 10%. So we have, as mentioned, 2 more years of Safe Restart funds to help mitigate our tax impacts, and most of it is being used up this year. Once that's gone, essentially we have to be self-funding. So this is the table that you saw last time that showed how we have used our Safe Restart money and how we're projecting to use it over the next 2 years. No new information here, but if everything's approved as presented, we'll have roughly $127,000 left for next year, which is roughly equivalent to just under 1% of taxes. In terms of the transition to full revenues, this year we are using $410,000 in Safe Restart and what I call an additional allocation of surplus of $136,000 Our base surplus that we use every year is roughly 250. So anything above that, like we have this year, I call extra mitigation. So without Safe Restart funds, the tax increase would have been 3.2% higher going into this budget year. So that's the impact it has had over the course of 4 years and continues to do so. So our total tax mitigation is just under $800,000 between those sources I outlined there, which is a tax increase equivalent to 4.3% this year. Next year will be just under 2%. So those are those two little chunks of that cost versus revenue chart I showed you a while back. Once the Safe Restart disappears, that chunk will have to be made up through taxation, and I anticipate continuing to use surplus to the level that we do to just add that extra little bit of funding. Since budget was presented, we've all heard about the Growing Communities Fund, a recent provincial announcement about one-time grant funding for communities across BC, a total allocation of $1 billion, and we have now learned that the town's allocation is $3.82 million, which is a substantial contribution from the province. We don't yet know what the conditions are for using those funds. We've heard some indication through the media releases made by the province, but we don't expect to have the full details of what those funds can be used for and how quickly they have to be used ahead of budget approval. And I don't think that's a problem. I think we can easily get around that and make adjustments later as required. We will not know before the completion of the budget process, but it's not important in my mind. So I would recommend that the town continue along our timeline to approve our budget, and we know there are many imminent demands for using those $3.82 million in terms of the active transportation plan, climate action initiatives, infrastructure funding, as well as town facilities. So you might wonder what I think are the most likely uses of that $3.82 million. In my mind, I would recommend that it's a combination of short and medium-term capital projects, such as what I mentioned, the roundabout perhaps, if we don't get the full grant funding that we're expecting, the active transportation plan, climate adaptation initiatives, and a series of other smaller capital initiatives. I'm assuming at this point that it'll be mainly for capital purposes, but again, we don't yet know, and as soon as I have those details, council will be aware. It's also a chance to stretch our infrastructure dollars, because we know that there are certain parts of our infrastructure reserve that are looking like they're going to be deficient over the next few years. So it's a way to stretch our dollars, maybe get more done now, and defer some of those anticipated reserve contribution increases. And it will also help to stretch our other reserve funds, like the what used to be known as the gas tax fund, as well as amenities, some of our other reserves. So just if we have to use up these provincial funds fairly quickly, it's a way to redirect them to capital projects that are currently funded by other means, and then leave those funds for use later. We have lots of tools, and I'll be giving you the best advice I can about how to make the best short, medium, and long-term use of those funds. I don't think I've let you down over the last 12 years, so hopefully you have a bit of trust. As part of this budget process, there is the option of allocating some of that new grant money as conditional funding for certain tax-funded projects. So, as an example, if we have a $50,000 capital project that's tax-funded, we could either allocate one of our internal reserves, such as the General Capital Reserve, to replace tax funding, and then when the use of those funds is well known, we could make an adjustment in our budget to replace that temporary funding with the new grant. Just as an example. I'd caution against maybe conditionally using this new grant until we learn the parameters, because if those uses that we envision are deemed ineligible, then we'll have to adjust anyway. Might be easier to use funding we already know we have and adjust later with new information than to make presumptions now. So in considering this 3.82 million in one-time funding, it's important to remember that it is one time, just like the Safe Restart grant, and it will eventually be used up. So at the end of the day, we have to look at our long-term financial sustainability. Once that money disappears, we have to ensure we're in a position where we're self-funded. And kicking the phase back to full revenues down the road is not something I could recommend as a responsible action. I would like to see those funds used for things that we are planning to do anyway, and maybe advance a few initiatives, but not to delay getting back to full revenues. Because somebody's going to have to pay for it down the road, and like we were learning with the Safe Restart, if we don't pay attention to getting back to full revenues in a phased-in manner, it's going to be a big one-time increase, and we're trying to avoid that. Last year's tax increase was a little bit larger than we were used to. I think it's only the third increase over 3% in my 12 years at this podium. But that was partly because we knew we were phasing back to full revenues, and I think Council did the right thing there. I don't want to be presumptuous and assume that Council's looking for reductions, but I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you how those might be achieved if you're looking to get there. So the most likely sources, and I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm almost done with the preamble, and then we'll get to it, but a couple of more points. The most likely sources for reductions are capital projects that are funded from current taxes. So we can either replace that tax funding with reserves or other funding. We can defer projects or we can cancel them entirely. But cutting back too much will make it just that much harder to get back to traditional levels later. So another source of reductions could be tax-funded supplemental items, and we'll cover those in turn. And there are potentially two discretionary transfers to reserve. One, the Climate Action Reserve, which we started up last year. We have a second contribution this time around. With the news about the new grant funding, I think it's less critical to maybe look at these reductions, but they are in place should Council wish to consider them. Using more surplus is another way, but I think we're already pushing the envelope as to what I'm comfortable with, so I would prefer not to go there. You might ask, why not the operating budget? It's because of that surplus funding. So right now we're allocating over $350,000, and if we're going to cut the operating budget in any manner, my first inclination would be to also cut the amount of surplus we're relying on, because then we have less opportunity for operational savings throughout the year, which I rely on to make up for that surplus funding, because I do expect to come in even at the end of the year with a balanced budget and balanced operations. So even though I'm balancing the budget with $350,000 plus, I don't expect to be using that in a typical year. So that's essentially the end of my intro. What I would propose now is we go through the budget in this manner. We start with the supplemental requests, move on to any general operating questions the Council might have. Then we move on to the utility budgets, water and sewer, tax-funded capital, and then perhaps other capital if Council wishes. So each of those sections will have a brief introduction from myself, maybe a couple of slides, and then it'll be open to Council for questions, deliberations. And once we are through these 5 sections, I do have a brief closing set of slides to set us up for the next meeting, if that is to Council's satisfaction.
Mr. Hissick, just before you go to general operating, I might want to open it up to council members. If you could just go to the previous slide for a moment. Thank you, and thank you for the excellent introduction presentation. And so once we begin this process, those are the sections of the binder that we have. My suggestion will be that we turn to the particular pages and speak to specific items. But if we could hold off on questions about specifics within any of those sections of the budget, and are there any questions for Mr. Hissick with regards to the community funding or anything of a general nature? And I see Councillor Garnett, I'll let you go first, and I do have a question or two myself, but I'll turn to others before myself.
Thank you, Mayor, through you to staff. Thank you very much, Andrew, for your presentation, and for your staff on all the hard work they've done with this budget. Not easy in these inflationary times, and I think the budget speaks to itself. I think it's a good balance of putting money in reserves, initiatives from the strategic plan from council, and keeping and enhancing our core services in a level the community expects. So congratulations on that. My only question really is with regards to the announcing of the funding, and just to a point you made about potentially bringing items forward in terms of timing to get things done sooner. And I'm just wondering if staff could speak to staff capacity, whether that's something that might pose a problem. We have the funding, we might want to move things forward, but are we able to actually get them done?
Well, that's an excellent point, Councillor, is that capacity is an issue. There are certain things that can be contracted out, but every contract needs to be managed. You can't just put it out there and expect it to be done up to our standards. So there is capacity limitation in terms of how much we can bring things forward. Many initiatives will need planning, and that's why they're not in the current year. So it's an excellent point to consider.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Other questions? I have a question, and it's page 7, which is the financial plan summary, which shows the revenue expenditures and property tax, and has the property tax increase highlighted in yellow at the bottom. So that's page 7, and it's showing what the increases are from 2023 through to the 5 years to 2027. And in earlier presentations or presentations at previous meetings, you did speak to this in one sense when you were introducing it, but we've heard this evening that the increase for 2023 is 4.93%, and it's at 7.99% for 2024. If I can summarize, we did hear from yourself, Mr. Hissick, that the figures going on beyond even to some degree for 2024 and beyond 24, staff don't put the same level of work into those budgets, and the budgets are very much refined as we move from year to year. But seeing that 8% increase in 2024, one of the concerns I might have is that we have an increase that is 2% below inflation this year. We don't know what inflation is going to be next year. I'm not saying we're going to want to tie our tax increase to inflation, but I'm wondering if you can speak to that 8% figure. And again, I'm not suggesting that, you know, whatever figure we have, if we consider it high, we're just going to go to that new community fund and be able to, you know, take it down to what we want. But I think to the point you made earlier, we need to demonstrate financial sustainability and use those funds wisely over the short, medium, and long term.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That topic is covered in my staff report, and that it's quite typical for year 2 to be the highest projection, because when we look at reducing the impacts on year 1, the first opportunity to defer an initiative is to year 2. But in my time here, when year 2 becomes the current budget year, we have never come in anywhere close to the year 2 projection. So I think you need to have a bit of faith that next year will be similar. I believe last year our year 2 projection was closer to 10%, and as you see, we came in at less than half that, even with the inflation pressures. So while it seems like a daunting number, it's perhaps something that could have been evened out given more time to do our budgeting, but I think we rely on you trusting us to not come in at that number in year 2 because we've proven that we can.
Thank you. My second question is with regards to the slides you presented and information you presented about the new growing community fund. And that is it generally understood at this point, appreciating we don't have all the details yet, that the fund will not be able to be used for operating?
I'm making a bit of an assumption there, but I think it's a reasonable one. If it turns out that there are some operational uses, I think that would give us more flexibility, obviously, but I'm fairly certain it's not intended to allow communities to fund their operations at the expense of ongoing financial sustainability.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hissick. Alternate colleagues, seeing no further questions, please proceed. I think you were going to go to supplemental requests on next slides.
Just a quick word on some of the key impacts on the general operating budget. Supplemental requests, there's a net increase from last year of $189,000, plus the full impact of supplemental items that were added last year, which comes to about $110,000. That's for essentially full year of operation for items that were approved for a partial year last year. Our reserve contributions are up by $84,000 in the general fund, i.e. tax funded, and a further $117,000 in the utilities. The RCMP contract increase is fairly hefty, almost 1% of taxes, and we have an increase in tax funded capital of $93,000. So a word on policing costs. We all know that this is the largest proportion of our budget departmentally, and it's been growing over the last number of years. We were at close to 1.2 million in 2009, and for the first time we are over $2 million in projected policing costs for 2023. And this doesn't even include the impact of the additional officer that we approved last year, which is not anticipated to start until 2024. That's a lot of red right there. Community support funding, I always like to highlight this because this too has increased a lot over the years. So we were down under 600,000 back in 2014, and we are now over $1 million. And these are primarily funding for our community organizations like Mary Winspear Center, the Shaw Center, the museum, Artsy, and a number of smaller initiatives. So moving on to supplemental requests, we're going to consider them in this order, starting with the 2023 one-time requests, moving on to the 2023 ongoing, and then we'll look at future year supplemental items. And I would ask that any preliminary changes or reductions or additions be made in the form of a resolution once council is prepared to go there. And this starts on page 14 in your budget binders.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. So for new colleagues, and a reminder to other colleagues, that for example, in all of these one-time request areas, I think there's 36 items. And so what we're looking to do is just start at the top, and if a council member has a question or wants to speak to a possible change with regards to that item, now would be the time to do that. If, as Mr. Hissick indicated, if we're going to make a change of some sort, we would do it by resolution. But we don't have to speak to every item. If we're as we go through the items, if we're passing them, then what it means is when we complete the review, and after any changes that are made by resolution, we will at a future time, perhaps this evening, perhaps next Tuesday, we would go ahead and approve the general operating budget as amended. And as Mr. Hissick indicated, any changes that council make by resolution this evening, he would indicate that change in his presentation next Tuesday. So Turning to page 14, page 15, when the one-time requests for 2023 start, do colleagues have any particular, starting up the top? I'm looking at the first one. I'm not going to name them each, but just so that we're all in the same place. The very first one is update of the Town of Sydney logo. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. This is a small amount, so I'm assuming this is all going to just be done by staff and there isn't any, is there any citizen input that will be looked to be collected for this?
I'll defer to Ms. Judson for this.
Thank you, Councillor. This funding actually would be covering the cost of a graphic designer, and we've gotten 3 quotes for that, so that would be the professional piece. To reduce costs, we would only be using this new logo on an immediate basis in areas where it's just digitally being put on our website, on social media, on news releases. But when it comes to printed materials, we would use the logo as those pieces were being replaced anyways.
Oh, no, I mean, are we going to be asking residents what they think
for
of
that second
potential
part.
new logos that the designer comes up with, or is that staff is just going to select?
Yeah, so the process would start likely with us reaching out to the community through a small survey, through social media, and a news release. Actually, it's not decided yet, so I can't say for sure about the news release, but we'd reach out to the community to get a sense of what symbolizes Sydney to them, what they would like to see represented, knowing that we can't exactly paint a clear picture, but we're looking for an essence of our community. And from there, we would be sharing that feedback with the graphic designer. That graphic designer would come back to us with a few examples, and likely the CAO would identify which are perhaps the 2 strongest. We'd put those back out to the public, gather input, and council would take that input and let us know if there's one that you'd like us to implement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Judson. Thanks for the question, Councillor Duncan. Next item, Council? Going down this list. Okay, not seeing any discussion. I'm still on page 15, and I'm down to the second last item, storm drainage. The Mermaid Creek stormwater management. We know from discussion at a previous meeting that the allocation that we had put in the budget and approved in a previous year, perhaps last year, was $30,000, and that council by resolution resolved to allocate $25,000 of this particular line item to the Peninsula Streams Mermaid Creek restoration project. Mr. Hissick in his report has indicated that recommendation that we leave the remaining $5,000 in this Mermaid Creek stormwater management line. My question through to staff is, given the indication that Peninsula Streams has provided on the timing of doing those Mermaid Creek restoration projects, when would staff see it being realistic to do this Mermaid Creek stormwater management, and should we be putting something in the budget to replace this in a future year, not necessarily 2023, but in a future year?
Thank you, through to the mayor. The staff are proceeding with overall stormwater management alternatives study this year, and based on that, we would potentially bring back a Mermaid Creek stormwater management plan in the future years. We do expect catchment-specific stormwater management plans potentially to be an outcome of that study. So we would bring it back if warranted based on the study we are completing this year. So it would be brought back next year for a future budget year if that was something that's warranted.
Okay, thank you. So we're comfortable leaving it at 5,000 and then staff bringing it forward in a future year. Yeah, no, that's great. So Mr. Hissen, my question is the resolution that was passed by council at a previous meeting has in effect amended this? We don't have to pass a separate resolution with regards to that change? That's
correct. Essentially, this is somewhat pre-approved with that previous decision, and the funding will be set aside. If it doesn't proceed this year, it'll be carried forward, so we won't have to raise new funds for it next year if it's delayed a year.
Thank you. I have a question. My next question is with regards to the next item, environmental projects, active transportation, the 2 celebration stations for Go by Bike weeks, and that's $7,000. Is that a cost that's incurred just in 2023, and if we wanted to repeat this in future years, is it a lower cost? Would it be the same cost?
I believe we are looking to form partnerships with peninsula municipalities about maybe doing this on a rotational basis. So at this time, we weren't prepared to call this an ongoing item. I think let's just see how it goes this time, and we'll have better information in 2024.
Thank you. Councillor Garner?
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry, I guess you caught me asleep at the wheel there. It's okay. As far as process, there were some items on this page that I was considering for deferral. So is there something you want me to move, or can we just have an open discussion about it? Well, how would you like to proceed?
Now's the time, as I say, we're on page 15. If there's any items on this page that you'd like to have a discussion about, and then based on discussion, make a resolution, this is an open meeting to,
Okay.
To do that.
Yeah, Councillor Duncan brought up, it's not that I don't feel these items have worth, and I think they're important for the town, and they are small in value, but I'm just looking for areas where we can find something. And the update of the Town of Sydney logo, although I do appreciate the value associated with it, I do think it's something we can defer to a year moving forward, just one at a time. Do you think? Okay. So I'm just wondering if any other colleagues have any they want to weigh in on this.
Councillor O'Keefe. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. I initially had some questions on the logo and put some questions to staff prior to the meeting. And from one of the reasons that I liked why they were doing this was to make it, there was an accessibility component, as I understand. I don't know if staff want to comment on that. But that's one of the big things that I understood is that it's hard to read for persons with visual disabilities online, and so for that reason I thought it was a good idea and kind of a good step towards making our information more accessible for people.
You are right, Councillor, that is part of it. And just to point out, some of these items, we're talking pennies, and when you weigh the benefit of doing something, whether it's this item or something similar, you have to think, is the benefit worth a few pennies? That's how I look at it when I bring it forward. But obviously, anything on this list is up for council debate.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. Councillor Garnett? Sorry, I'll turn to if there's any other comments. Seeing none, Councillor Garnett?
No, that's an excellent. Thank you for your input on that. I would just say that I look at every dollar as not my money, it's tax dollars from the people in the community. So a penny's a penny. You never know how people are living their lives. So anyways, also the Develop Parks and Trails brochure for Town of Sydney. I think although I see value in that, I think that's definitely something that I noted as something that I think we could hold off on until a future budget.
So that's on page 16, halfway down?
Yeah. So again, all these I'm going to bring forward. I'm just listening, wanting to hear my fellow colleagues' thoughts on these. So.
I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe, and then I have a question through the staff. But Councillor O'Keefe?
Yeah, I had also looked at that one as well, but I think I'm fine with it. Again, staff provided some additional information that they would be incorporating into that brochure, information about accessible features at the park, so I think that's good. And I think in terms of more people wanting to enjoy our outdoor spaces and know where those are, especially for tourists, I anticipate this might be made available online or the SBIA, a visitor center. So, for $5,000, I thought it was a good investment. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan before I speak.
Thank you. I mean, I'd looked at this one as well, and the logo, but I eventually just kind of came off with it's pennies compared to the rest of the budget. It wouldn't save any money, and these are probably things that staff have identified need to be done, and future years look like we'll have even potentially larger tax impacts because we won't have the Safe Restart funding. So I'd rather do them now if there's something staff thinks is important. So I guess my question through to staff would be, one of the things I thought, I mean, in addition to Councillor O'Keefe's, information she got about, just accessibility, probably parking access, things like that, would be whether we can sneak in information on stewardship of these parks. And what made me think of this was the incident we had at Ray Creek with, I believe it was the tide they thought was eventually put down there. And I keep telling people who keep telling me, you gotta get rid of that moss, you just put some tide on it. And I have to explain to them why we don't do that. And they're always really shocked because they do this all the time and their face goes white. So I'm wondering if this is just a little information we could put in some of our parks about just water stewardship, just, a really simple one about this incident happened and did you know not to do this? Or, did you know do this? Is something, if you have questions, call this group. Just, I think that might be a really way to kind of get a value added thing on our something that would just be a recreational brochure to get kind of some benefit to the town as well, and hopefully we would have fewer incidents and perhaps maybe better stewardship of our park.
Sounds like a great town talk initiative as well. So.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Sorry, Councillor O'Keefe, did you speak on this one?
Yes.
Sorry, I'll go as his first time speaker.
Okay, sure.
So not wanting to get into the fine detail, but is there a general intention that it would be available online and printed copies as well? Okay, thank you. I'm in support of this. The North Saanich did this brochure or did this several years ago, and it's available. It's been available on their website for a number of years. It's available as a printed brochure to pick up from the North Saanich Hall, and it's available at the Sydney Information Centre, and they go through a good number of copies. So I'm fully supportive of this. Quite frankly, I see it as an active transportation initiative to encourage people to use our parks and trails. Councillor O'Keefe?
Thank you. Councillor Duncan brought up a good point about the stewardship thing, and it also made me think about First Nations. And I know that we had talked some time ago about Ray Creek or Kelsick Creek, and having some additional information there about the history of how First Nations use that. So I'm not sure if we're planning to do that, but just a suggestion. It would be nice to have some acknowledge of First Nations and their involvement in some of those spaces, and also getting to the issue of the environment, things like Ray Creek, talking about how that's used for fish spawning and other wildlife or plant in the area. I think those are good things to add rather than just sort of a recreational thing in terms of here's where you can go and walk. So just those comments, and I support the brochure. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further discussion on brochure? Seeing none, Councillor Garnier?
Yeah, just one more, and it's not a motion. The only other one that I had on this that I looked at that I pulled out was the Beacon Park bandshell wood refinishing. When I took a look at it, it seemed like the vast majority of it was in pretty good condition still. It's just one part that seems to be a little, and needs a bit of work, and then there's a couple of pieces that have fallen off that could be replaced. Again, wanting other colleagues' feedback on what they think.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. Mr. Hasek?
I'm wondering if council would like some information from staff before further feedback.
That would be helpful.
Do we have anything to add?
Good evening, Mr. Robinson.
Good evening, everyone. Just a little bit of history on the bandshell. The recommendation from the manufacturer who supplies the coating was that they would do an assessment every 5 years on the condition of the coating. So the first one was done in year 5. They said that we could go an extra 2 years. There's a special conditioning that you use to clean the surface, and then you apply the treatment to it. That was done, the last time that was done was 7 years ago. So we're at that time schedule again, and it's just like any road rehabilitation or anything like that. The sooner that you put that secondary application on, the greater the longevity is. If you let it deteriorate a little bit longer, it's that old cliche, rust or rot never sleeps. Once it gets in, it just starts to migrate, and for us to be able to do a robust cleaning this year and then apply another treatment surface, it'll keep in the pristine shape that it's been right now. And again, we're looking at 12 years it's been in there, and probably a fairly severe environment through the winters and things like that. A lot of moisture in the air, lots of different things like that. And like I say, it still looks in pretty good shape because it's been kept well maintained. So the cycle's up for a new treatment right now, and we could probably do it extremely quickly. Do the cleaning, do the application. If we had to do restoration work, that's going to add time and costs, and perhaps we wouldn't get all the degradation out of the wood treatment moving forward. So that's the purpose behind that.
Thank you, and that information about the manufacturer is excellent. Thank you. That helps provide me some clarity.
Thank you. Any further comment on that particular item? Okay, seeing none, so it looks like the one-time request for 2023, we've covered all of those. They finish on page 17. Councillor O'Keefe?
Oh, are we,
We're on the one-time request from page 15 to page 17.
oh, so, okay, so we can comment on things on page 17 then?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm gonna turn my attention to the
Microphone, Councillor O'Keefe. Thank you.
turning my attention to the SBIA business development support for the 60,000, and so I will move that the 60,000 allocation for the SBIA business manager not be approved, and that the funds be reallocated for other economic development initiatives arising from the town's new economic development strategy.
Seconder? Okay.
Sure, so, first of all, I want to say that, acknowledge that I think the SBIA did a great job of supporting the business community during the pandemic and afterwards. They were a good source of communication in terms of helping businesses navigate all the changing public health orders, keeping them updated on different sorts of funding programs that were available. They curated the volumes of information that were come out and communicated that to the industry. And I think it was especially valuable for the downtown business community that was the most impacted by the pandemic. Now that we're coming out of the pandemic, we've done an economic development strategy, and what the SBIA is proposing with this 60,000, as I understand it, is that this would go towards the SBIA providing support to businesses outside of the SBIA, so that being Harbor Road and the west side. And so my feeling at this time is that I think that if the SBIA wants to do this for their downtown people, I think that's great. And the members of the SBIA are paying for that out of their levy. But if the town is going to look at providing support to areas outside of the SBIA, I think we should be doing more to communicate with them directly to find out what they want. And so I look at the economic development strategy that we're sort of going through, and there's been some good recommendations that come from that. You know, one of the things that mentioned in the ED strategy was looking at having a business improvement area that covers the west side and Harbor Road. So we found out through the pandemic that there are very different types of businesses there. Also looking at how to help the marine and the west side industry help to expand that part of our business. So not to take anything away from what the SBIA has done in the past, but I think in moving forward, if we're going to allocate $60,000 to help businesses that are outside the BIA, I think we should be talking directly to that sector. And I don't think that the SBIA has the mandate to speak for those other sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan and then Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you. My thought would be to vote against this simply because it's not tax funded, so that won't change anything. It's grant funded, and the grant funding was the Safe Restart funds. And the rationale for the continuation is based on the same rationale and extending the program that was started with those funds due to COVID. So I see it as consistent with the original funding and the original granting that was required. Part of their rationale is to have a person, an employee who's capable of having the time to do this work. And since we don't currently have an economic development coordinator, what we've done is essentially arrange with the SBIA to do exactly what you're asking for by paying a person who's already working there, who's already started doing this work. So I would rather continue to give them money for work that they've started doing and have, you know, some sort of strategy in place, plan in place, to do those economic development initiatives rather than pull the money back when we don't know that we have any different initiatives. And what would likely happen is we would have initiatives that would require a person to do them, and we would need to fund a person. And we already have a perfectly good person that's accessed. And so I'd rather keep funding them under the same arrangement. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Councillor Rintoul.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and I'll be brief and concise with my comments because we could have a long evening here. I won't support the motion for exactly the same reasons Councillor Duncan has mentioned. Look, this would create a void in business development for the town. There was no one fulfilling this function, and we've been fortunate to have the SBIA take this on, and by waiting to some future date to allocate funds, you know, for an economic development plan initiative, we could find ourselves prolonging this period of void. So I won't support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul. Councillor Duck.
Yes, I will support this motion. I agree with my colleagues relative to this is outside the BIA mandate, and I think it's more important that we directly service those two areas especially, and with the forthcoming new information we've received on the ACDEV plan, I think there's an opportunity here to make sure that we're servicing them more appropriately. And as I said, I don't think that's within the current mandate of the SBIA. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'm going to turn to Mr. Humboldt, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So as Council recalls, staff were tasked with preparing a report to determine a lead entity for the ACDAP plan. And as Council's aware, that hasn't yet been brought forward to Council. So staff, myself, is in the process of developing that report. Given the background work that I've done on this, looking at different options, I can say with a level of conviction that to eliminate this would have, I think, a significant impact based on what I'm seeing in terms of being able to move forward with any degree of effectiveness with respect to the ACDEV plan. So I'm not going to sort of presume to indicate the findings in my report because I'm still in the process. But as I said, I can tell you that this will have an impact if the decision goes that way.
Thank you, Mr. Humboldt. Mr. Hisik?
I would like to very much concur in looking forward. It makes sense to take advantage of effective partnerships we already have, a bird in the hand kind of concept, as opposed to hoping that we can create those later. Not all of this money will be used to extend their services beyond their mandate area. Part of it will, but it'll also contribute to them doing additional support work within the BIA area as well.
Thank you, Mr. Hisik. I'll turn to Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Before I speak, I just wanted to, Councillor Novak, I think you were the seconder, so I don't feel like I want to jump ahead of you.
I'm prepared to yield the floor to you, and I'll speak after.
Thank you. So I just want clarification from Councillor O'Keefe. When you say reallocate the money, are you referring to putting it into the Economic Development Fund that we currently have, I think, a balance of 2,000? Would that be your intention? Okay, thank you. Thank you for the clarity. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My initial feelings on this were to support the motion, but I've given it some additional thought in light of what I've heard from staff. And my first priority would be to see that our economic development plan goes forward. And this is a substantial amount of funding. I'm not satisfied that the SBIA in its present format would use the funding to fully elaborate our ECDEV plan. I'm not sure what the plan is with the SBIA to use this money. But at the same time, I think it's a step in the right direction. I think business development is a critical piece for the community, and I'd like to see it move forward. So I think I'm going to vote against this motion at this time.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I won't, I'll speak now. I won't support this motion. I think the information and the presentation we had from the BIA is there are a number of very tangible initiatives, what I'll call initiatives on the ground with the business community. And we heard that there is participation both from downtown businesses and from businesses in the other business districts in Sydney. And as I think Councillor Duncan was alluding to, or referencing, is that there is already a people resource executing these tangible initiatives. And so to replace it in another form is going to be questionable. And this is the financial resource that helps bring it together. In terms of the BIA's mandate, Council provided 2 years of funding at this level, the previous 2 years. And while it has been spoken of that it was pandemic related and we used pandemic funds to support it, we can see that the initiatives, the tangible initiatives that the BIA are doing are supportive for the general business, for the business community, independent of the pandemic or the effects of the pandemic or coming out of the pandemic. So I fully support this. I fully support granting the money and therefore will oppose the motion. I'll turn to any second-time speakers. Councillor O'Keefe.
Sure, just to address a couple things. So, to say that it's grant funded and it doesn't matter anyways, well, it matters. I mean, it means we could better divert that money elsewhere. In regards to, as I say, there's other things that, so for example, that SIP is working on a profile for the marine industry. When I looked at the plan that the SBIA had for what they were planning to do for the coming year, there was nothing there that related specifically to the marine sector or the west side. And when I asked that question of the presenters at the time, in terms of what do they see themselves doing, what were the particular issues that they would be able to help with the west side and the marine sector, they had no response, that they hadn't had an opportunity yet. And so to me, that signals that they're not plugged in to the west side and the marine sector. We know that during COVID, the marine sector and the industry kept our economy going. They're very different from the BIA. So my issue is that we should not be relying on people who have expertise in the downtown core, which is good, but to assume that they are now going to be able to support the west side and Harbour Road with having no consultation, no ideas in their plan in terms of how they're going to do that. So it just doesn't seem fair to those business sectors to say that we're going to hand over your needs to the downtown people who really have no insight or knowledge in terms of what you need to grow your sector. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. Councillor Duck.
Yes, I want to echo that right now the Sydney Business Improvement Area gets significant funding from the levy they receive, plus additional funding through SEAG and through tourism. So they are getting pretty good funds, and I'm concerned that we're not going to have any associated funds. As my colleague Councillor Garnett pointed out, there's only 2,000 in the ACDEV planning. This would be a good use of safe restart funds for the safe restart of our economic development plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. My understanding from listening to colleagues is that if if this motion were to succeed and this funding was not provided, that the tangible programs that the BIA has been running for the business community, the entire business community, and the entire business community has been participating, would not carry on. And so I'm understanding that those who don't support it are not attaching value to what the BIA has been doing for the business community and what they would be doing forward. In terms of speaking, while the BIA hasn't come forward to take on additional things, such as the marine-related things in the West Sydney, those are things that are in the ACDEV plan and can carry forward. The BIA has indicated that they've used the resources, I believe, productively in the last 2 years for what they've done, and they would be continuing that rather than taking additional things on. So I do attach value to what the BIA has been doing and what they would continue to do. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duncan, myself, Councillor O'Toole, and Councillor Novick. The motion is defeated. Councillor Keefe, you still have the floor.
I have nothing for we're just looking at the one-time supplement.
Yeah, if we could finish up the one-time request, and then we'll go on to the next next one. So a last call, if you will, for any of the one-time requests for 2023 on pages 15 to 17. Seeing none, we'll turn to the ongoing requests. That is, they'll start in 2023, but they'll continue beyond. Mr. Hissick, did you want to introduce it all?
I have nothing further to add at this point, but I'll entertain any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hissick. So we're on pages 18 and 19. Councillor Keefe.
Thank you. I'll turn my attention to the voluntary contribution to the CRD Art Service. And I will make the motion that the $10,000 to support CRD Arts be allocated to Artsy to supplement the Saanich Peninsula Arts and Culture Grant Program.
Second?
We have it moved and seconded. I'll turn to the mover and then the seconder. Councillor Keefe.
Sure. So in the past, we approved this contribution, and my recollection, it was we felt we had an obligation to make a contribution to the larger arts ecosystem in the CRD. However, what I've recently come to realize, and as a liaison for Artsy, is that Artsy is making some significant contributions to the Greater Victoria ecosystem in a number of ways. So their membership is open to everybody in the CRD. And so, for example, 30% of their members come from Victoria and other places around the CRD. Artists from throughout the region are allowed to display their work at the gallery. They are able to participate in the studio tours. Artsy also organizes the Coast Capital Art Display, which is something where Coast Capital displays art in their locations. And so that's not just here, but it's in Victoria as well. Another thing that I thought was admirable, or an advantage with this, with the Artsy program, is that it's very difficult for artists to get access to the CRD program. So to apply to get funding for program from the CRD Arts program, you need to be a registered non-profit organization or society. And so that makes it very difficult for sort of just an artist who wants to do something. They can't apply for that sort of funding. And I guess the other thing is that so they have all of the artists who are members of Artsy, and that even if they're outside of Sydney and the Saanich Peninsula, so they're allowed to apply for funding through Artsy, even though they're in Victoria, as long as the grant that they're getting relates to a function out here on the Saanich Peninsula or benefits our community in some way. I think also in terms of economic development, one of the recommendations we got in the feedback on our ED plan is that we should try and nurture a positive community spirit through investments in public art and arts program, community events and event spaces. So I think this is something where we could do, I think, make better use of that $10,000 out here on the peninsula to help our economy, and also I think it's a better way to support local artists than the CRD Arts Program. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Keefe. I'll turn to the seconder, Councillor Duck.
I just concur with everything my colleague has said and have nothing to add at this point.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to Councillor Garnett, then Councillor Duncan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I'll support the recommendation. I was really impressed with the letter that we received. The rationale makes a lot of sense to me. And the one thing that I longed on to, and it's just kind of my mentality way of thinking, is the fact that every penny of that $10,000 will go to people. And they focused on the administrative costs. And there are those when you're in a bigger organization. And the fact that that money in its entirety will go to people in our community to better the peninsula and the arts and the culture was a real push for me to go along with this. I just don't like throwing. For me, it's giving money away when it can actually be making a difference. So I'll support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I guess two questions through to staff. I believe, I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about CRD arts funding last council, and this $10,000 was what we came up with. And I feel this is only the second year that we would be providing this amount. And I believe did we talk about it being year to year, or did we give kind of a time frame of like, we'll try this for 5 years and then see how it goes
Mr.
to
Hissack?
the CRD?
I believe it's the third year that we're considering this matter. And last year I brought it forward for ongoing funding, as I did this time around. And council was not willing to go beyond 1 year at a time. I'm hoping this would be the time when we make some contributions, since we're benefiting so much for regional arts without being members.
Thank you. And so my second question, just looking, community support, we've got the 1.2 million in there. And is there we already have a contribution to Artsy in there, do we not? Oh, how much is it?
I believe we're up to 44,800 total for Artsy, and this particular request came, unfortunately, out of the blue. Staff had no time to really react to it.
Okay, thank you. I think I would probably vote against this at this time, simply because it is something that it would be out of the blue, and considering how much work we spent on coming up with an amount last term, to yank it again in our third year from the CRD, I'd like to at least make a decision if we want to have more funding to the Artsy about that as a separate issue. So I think maybe I would be open to the discussion of whether we feel we would not fund this going forward, and give direction to staff about, this is the last year, we don't see the value in it, and in future years, maybe we actually up Artsy's, annual amount because they provide this much service. But I don't like the idea of having one organization, which can always come up with good reasons that they need more funding. Every organization, every nonprofit can, and kind of take it away from another organization that we've kind of said we would support going forward, and would be removing that funding at a bit of a last minute. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I'll turn to Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, and as Councillor Duncan notes, we've had it in past. I appreciate what Artsy does, and their granting locally to support local artists. But I think we have to acknowledge, Mr. Hissack touched on it, that we as a community use CRD arts in a very broad sense, and have access to CRD arts. And so I think this is, in my mind, kind of the least level of support at which we can show as a community for that relationship, that we're very much interconnected as an arts and culture sector, and I think the town may want to have a discussion with regard to longer term funding. but in keeping with what Councillor Duncan has said, I certainly don't see pulling it this year, so I won't support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Toole. Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have a lot to say on this. However, I do support the motion. I think it's important that the town support local art organizations that truly reflect the community. From what I'm reading, and I don't know much about the CRD Art Service, but just from what I'm reading in the description, much of this funding will actually end up outside our area, and as such, even if there are some benefits that might accrue indirectly to local residents, I think the money would better be spent on local organization. I know a number of people who are artists in the community that use it regularly. There's an awful lot of volunteer hours that go into it. They probably need the funding more than most organizations, and so on that basis, I'm happy to support that motion.
Thank you, Councillor Novak. I think everyone else has spoken. I won't support this motion, and there's three significant reasons for that. And the first is that the basis of the argument, or the basic of the rationale, sorry, for this is that it's an either-or case, that we either support our local arts or we support our regional arts. And this is not an either-or situation. We should determine independently what level we feel we should support our local arts. And because there is a very successful 20-year plus CRD art service that grants millions of dollars to hundreds of organizations in a year, 10 out of 13 municipalities are participating, 9 or 10 municipalities are participating, including the CRD municipalities and electoral areas, including the Southern Gulf Islands electoral area, who sees benefit in this. And the reason is because there is a very significant regional arts ecosystem. So the first rationale is that let's not think of it as either or. What should we be doing to support our local artists through this excellent organization, and what should we be what should we be doing with CRD for the regional arts ecosystem for what I believe are the excellent things that they are doing. The second is that, and sorry, on this, the second argument is, well, it's part of the either or, and that is, if you take a look at parks, so Sydney and every other municipality in the Capital Regional District invests significantly in their local parks. We do so in Sydney when you look at with the number of parks we have on the waterfront and in neighborhoods and the facilities that are available in those parks. We invest very significantly and in an ongoing basis in our parks. CRD Parks has 13,300 hectares of parkland, and its annual budget is $17 million. I happen to be chair of the CRD Parks Committee this year. There are 33 regional parks and nearly 100 kilometers of regional trails. The CRD is a taxing authority, is a local government, and all Sydney residents and all of the residents throughout the entire CRD contribute to that CRD Park service. And so again, it's not a case of either or. We can support our municipal parks through our municipal tax funding, and our residents support the regional parks and trails through the CRD. And so again, it comes back to, I believe we should be giving separate consideration to the Arts Council. My next rationale is with regards to the current funding for the Artsy Community Arts Council. And so we have increased. The previous council increased, and I can't remember what the level was in the first year of our term in 2019, and I'm not asking staff for that. But what it grew to was $44,800, and we created $16,800 new dollars, allocated $16,800 new dollars to their granting program, which we had never provided before. In the general operating grant that we had provided, which we increased last term up to $25,000, it was it was less than that previously. They used to use some of those general funds for granting. And so we've created a new $16,800 fund for them, which they've had for, I'm not sure how many years now, but it began sometime during the last term. We increased the general funding to $25,000, and we also support them with a $3,000 grant with regards to the sculpture park. When I look at their 3-page report, the town of Sydney has provided $44,800, the district of North Saanich has provided $6,000, and the district of Central Saanich has provided $0 to either of those 3 programs. I think Sydney is contributing very significantly. This is in stating what is in their report in terms of the contributions from other municipalities. It is not a criticism of the other municipalities. It is merely highlighting the significant contribution that Sydney is making to regional arts. And so I think it's very important that we consider, and Sydney Arts Organization, there is another factor, and that is the previous director of the, fairly long time director of the Mary Winspear Center, communicated directly when input was requested in the CRD looking to improve the participation in the CRD Performing Arts Fund, was disappointed in part that the town of Sydney wasn't a participating member in the program, but also the framework of the CRD Arts. And so arts organizations that apply, arts organizations outside of Sydney, and quite frankly outside of North Saanich and outside of Central Saanich, that apply to the CRD Arts funding and want to perform at the Mary Winspear Center can't get grant funds to do that because the municipality is not supporting. And that was a detriment to the Mary Winspear Center because there were many small arts organizations that found the facilities at the Mary Winspear Center, found the rates at the Mary Winspear Center compared to the Royal Theatre, compared to the McPherson Theatre, or other venues, very affordable. And so it actually is, not participating is actually a counter to supporting. It's not just not participating, it's actually a counter to supporting the regional arts ecosystem. And so I would ask colleagues to carefully consider this motion. Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe?
Thank you. Just want to clarify and add a few things. I think it's important for people to understand that, first of all, this $10,000, none of it will be spent on the Saanich Peninsula or in Sydney. So it will go, and it's not something that I don't think that the CRD is going to be shocked, like, oh my goodness, we didn't get 10,000. How are we going to cope? They have lots of funding, and so I don't see that this is going to have an impact on the CRD. In terms of the Mary Winspear, they were disappointed to not have access to that because they are a nonprofit organization and they're able to provide funds, to get funds through Artsy. In terms of the arts community, it's very difficult for artists to find space to show their art, and the Artsy Gallery is one of the few places that they have access to that. In terms of supporting, I guess to me it's not an either or argument. I think the CRD provides lots of facilities. And they, like the McPherson, the Royal, the Art Gallery, and they have big fundraising arms to go out and get money for that. People make choices to go into town to support those organizations. I look at Langford and the West Shore, who they are looking to build an arts and culture hub there, and I think that's what we should be investing more in here. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Keefe. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I just want to quickly say I don't think it's fair for this to be presented as $10,000 that will not definitely be spent on the peninsula or for peninsula artists. I think that's something that should not be taken into account. We don't know where the $10,000 specifically that we put into the pool will be spent and which percentage goes to our artists or artists who perform here. It's whether or not our town wants to contribute to the CRD art service for the services they provide that our residents also participate in. Artsy provides visual artists space. CRD arts includes ballet, performance art, music, multiple types of art. $10,000 to support all of the other types of artists that exist and perform in the CRD that our residents may be or may go to view, or that we can support in other ways, and to frame it as though we need to send money to visual artists to take away from a service that provides all those other artists is definitely framing it as either or. And so, once again, I will not support this motion.
Thank you. Councillor Duncan, Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Actually, the statement that nobody in this community will get $10,000 is accurate in the sense that if we're not a member, the groups in this municipality can't apply for the funding. So $10,000 would not come back here, as I understand the agreement and what is written in the letter by Artsy. I think you have to be a full member, contributing the 42 or whatever it would be this year, for your organizations to, and be nonprofit to apply for these. And to be quite frank, in the last term, when there was a presentation from the CRD Arts, one of the questions I asked was, of our groups in our municipality, how many were successful and what kind of dollars they got back, and they never did answer me that question. So that's what led me to my initial response to come to the formula we came to last term. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan, then I'll speak myself.
Yeah, thank you. So it's not a matter of the organizations. Our residents belong to organizations that exist in other municipalities or may be centered in other municipalities. So a Sydney resident may belong to a theater group that, is incorporated in Saanich. And, there may be 5 municipalities worth of residents contributing to that. In exactly the same way as Councillor O'Keefe just pointed out, 30% of the people who participate in Artsy are not from our municipality. So if you're going to put it that way, why are we funding individuals who don't belong to our municipality to do this from this organization? We're trying to get it both ways here. So I think continuing to fund a service our residents would be using by joining other groups that are based in other municipalities is completely valid.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I'll speak briefly, and that is that the CRD Arts Performing Arts Service was initiated because the regional arts ecosystem needed the support in a coordinated fashion, and 9 or 10 municipalities are contributing several $1 million. We're looking at contributing 10,000, and it's an appreciation that our Sydney residents are participating in a number of ways in the regional arts ecosystem beyond what happens in Sydney or on the peninsula. I'll leave my remarks there.
As a point of clarification, I'd like to move that we close debate on this and call the question.
Second.
All in favor? Opposed? I'm calling the question whether we will call the question without further debate. That is a motion, that is a matter where council can resolve whether to call the question without further debate or defeat the motion, which would allow further debate. So I'll call the question on whether to end debate and call the question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duncan, myself, Councillor O'Toole, the motion carries. Councillor O'Keefe, did you have any other items in that section?
Not in this section, no.
Thank you. I do have a question, and it was actually something else I was going to ask staff, but the question is called now, but I'll still ask the question for confirmation. The Arts Center in Tallista Park that the Community Arts Council uses for their offices and gallery, that building is owned by the town of Sydney and maintained by the town of Sydney?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. That's another contribution that we're making to the local arts. But my question is with regards to the item above on page 18, which is pest control. The annual pest control program is required for buildings at Tallista Park. No, I think I'm fine there, thank you. I'll turn to colleagues if there are any questions on pages 18 or 19, which are ongoing requests initiating in 2023. Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The bottom page 19, Community Support Annual Grant, Sash Marine Rescue. I would like to make a
Sorry, you're moving on beyond this section?
No? It's the last item.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would like to make a motion to increase that $5,000 to $10,000.
Do we have a seconder?
I'll second for discussion.
Second for discussion, I'll turn to the mover.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sash Marine Rescue is an organization that I'm very familiar with. I worked for Marine Search and Rescue for 15 years. I was a coxswain getting called out in the middle of the night to help people, boaters, non-boaters who were in trouble on the water. These people save lives, countless numbers of lives every year. They are, for the most part, unheralded. You don't read a lot about it in the newspapers. They're a completely volunteer-run and operated organization. They have very few regular or consistent sources of funding. They typically have to raise money every year just to cover their operating expenses, which are substantial. Fuel, repairs, maintenance, equipment repairs for fast response vessels that are able to get out and help people in trouble on the water. They fundraise for their capital programs. It takes them years to raise enough money to be able to buy a boat. These boats get huge amounts of wear and tear. They don't survive for very long in a marine search and rescue environment, which is very, very heavily used. And I just think that these people deserve a lot more recognition. They deserve a lot more credit for the work that they do. And I know from having worked in these organizations, or in this organization actually, for well, almost 15 years, that they're constantly short of money. Whatever money they can raise is never enough. And so I think considering that the town of Sydney is a town that is on the water, that has a very strong marine history, that has several large marinas, both within the town and in its vicinity, that it would serve us very well to support this organization just a little bit more. And I would say that even $10,000 is probably not a tenth of their operating budget. So I would just like to see a little bit more support for these people that risk their lives 365 days a year in all weather and all conditions to help those people in trouble out in the water. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe as the second.
Thank you. I applaud the work that Saanich Marine Rescue do. And I seconded this because I'm somewhat supportive. However, my only reservation is that we haven't received a formal request from them. So I'm a little anxious about handing out money if it's not asked for. So I think I'd be more inclined if we had a formal request outlining what their financial need was. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to Councillor O'Toole and myself.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And if I may through to staff, by having them as a line item, correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't exclude them for applying for grant and aid, should they choose?
Never excludes them, but there's a strong discouragement to do so if they're also a line item. So we would expect that only in extraordinary circumstances would they come forward for additional funding. And that's typically what the Film Society does. Just to be clear, with respect to this item, they are a recurring grant, and council last year asked staff to bring it forward as a line item. I have not had a chance to specifically discuss with them what would be the appropriate level. I based this 5,000 based on a typical average request over the last number of grant years.
And if I may, follow up, the Mayor, through to Mr. Hissick, do you recollect, or can you let us know in recent years, because I do recall this is a standing request we've had through grants and aid, and I also recall council being receptive to providing them with perhaps additional funding if we had the latitude during the grants and aid discussion. So I recall this is one that we sort of hold back on and occasionally, you know, top up if we could. Do you recollect what sort of support we landed at despite what their request was?
Off the top of my head, I'd say we typically give them 2,000 to 5,000 per year.
Okay. So while I'm certainly supportive of the sentiment here and the organization, I would be inclined to look favorably upon a request from them during grants and aid, despite the fact that it may be a practice we've discouraged, only because in keeping with Councillor O'Keefe's comments, we haven't had a specific request from them for a need above this 5,000. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan.
Yeah, thank you.
Have myself on the speaking list.
Yeah, I will vote against this for the same reason that Councillor Rintoul and Councillor O'Keefe brought up. This organization did not come forward and ask for additional, for this funding for $10,000. I've been trying to remember how much they usually ask for in grants and aid, but Mr. Hissick has supplied that, you know, we never give them close to, like 5,000 is the top end of what they normally expect from us in a good year anyway. I would also remind council that we had an organization come forward with, remember, we thought was a $30,000 request, but then they used the 5,000 that we were giving them as a line item to deduct from that 30,000. So we gave them an additional 25,000, and we had a discussion of whether we should give them the additional 5,000 just in case, or whether we should, you know, take it back because they specifically didn't ask for it. I think the same justification applies. Unless the organization comes forward and says they need $5,000 from us, I don't think it's something we just add to the budget, because we were, again, being, you know, fiscally responsible, and we don't just add things that organizations haven't asked for. If this organization discovers that they're having funding problems and they need to come forward to the town with a proposal for an ongoing funding that is in addition to this, I will be happy to entertain that for future budgets or for, you know, one-time things that come for grant and aid, but I will not add to their budget without their request. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Yeah, I won't support the motion, but I just want to add a bit of context. And so, without specific numbers, the request from this organization was less than $5,000 for a number of years. And then during the pandemic, they came forward and they asked for an amount that I believe may have been greater than 5,000. And there was a year in grants and aid where we actually topped up the grants and aid fund with COVID restart funds. And part of it, I believe, went to this organization and part went to another organization. I don't think the detail or the numbers are particularly important, but that's just a bit of context. We shouldn't be surprised that this organization has not come forward by today asking for more money. They may not be aware that we have actually turned what was an annual grants and aid for as long as I can remember, and this is into the early 2000s, for additional funds because they've been applying at grants and aid, and we made a council made a decision at the end of last term to forward it to this part. So I'm not comfortable, and I don't want to jump ahead here, but I'm not particularly comfortable in considering an increase to this organization when grants and aid come forward, because grants and aid has been limited at about $16,000, and we always have more requests for funds than we can provide. So the intention was to, rather than debating and we'd increase the level to about 5,000, we'd done this with the museum, with other organizations like the Arts Council and Celebrations and so on. They were coming forward to us annually, and we've made them line items, and in some cases we have increased them, such as Peninsula Celebrations. But I wouldn't entertain without having interaction with them for tonight's meeting, allocating any more than this at this time. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duck, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Garnett, myself, Councillor O'Toole. Sorry, Councillor O'Keefe, were you?
Opposed.
Opposed? The motion is defeated. Thank you, Councillor Novick.
Thank you.
Did you have another item, Councillor Novick? Okay. Okay, so that is the last item in that ongoing request for 2023 on pages 18 and 19. We could turn the page to page 20, which is one-time requests on page 20 and 21 for the years 2024 to 2027. Mr. Hissick, did you want to comment at all?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. They are on the slide together, but I realize they might be different pages in the binder. Just to reiterate on some of the ongoing requests for future years. So, for instance, the firefighter and the deputy chief, as you were informed last year, leaving them in the budget at this time does not commit you to approving them. Council will get another crack at them later, either through the budget process or slightly ahead of the budget process, but none of these will be initiated until officially rubber stamped by council, and doesn't have to be tonight. So leaving them in today does not commit us to these future items. They're just an indication of what's coming your way. Some we can control, some like the dispatch that's coming our way, we cannot.
Okay, so thank you for the slide, Mr. Hissick, and we know that these are covered with a little bit more detail on pages 20, 21, and 22. I will turn to colleagues if there are any questions or comments or motions. Councillor Keith.
Thank you. Just a question through you to staff on the decommissioning of historic wells. And I know that's not till 2024, and it's not so much about the amount, but I'm wondering, is there any value in maintaining these for emergency purposes? Like, you know, in the event of, I don't know, earthquake or something where we don't have access to our regular water supply? I know that's been a topic of conversation in the past.
Very good question. That is something that we will be looking at as part of an emergency water supply study that we plan on doing this year, or I believe this year. Sorry, we do plan on doing it in the near future. However, the town does own many wells, like around North Saanich and in Sydney. They're historic wells that were in operation when Sydney was its own water district. And the Water Sustainability Act requires wells to be decommissioned if they're not in use for a certain amount of time. So we really do need to decommission ones that we have no intention of using. However, we may look at upgrading some as part of the emergency water supply study as well.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Sorry, a follow-up question to that is, if for whatever reason, sometime down the road, we wanted to recommission them, would the cost be similar? I mean, in today's dollars? Or that's very hard to answer.
Through to the mayor, my understanding is, although we haven't been through with this process, but I understand that they fill the wells, so it would mean re-drilling
okay.
if you were to recommission them. However, many, like, our wells are old. Existing wells are old, so they're probably not up to any seismic standard. So even to bring them up to seismic standard will likely be very expensive, more than this cost listed in this budget item.
Can staff please comment on how many wells there might be, and is there a pump on any of these wells currently?
There are 2 wells that have pumps on them. I believe, we just went through this, I believe there's 18 or so wells that we have record on. There's quite a few. Many of them are on private property now. That was once owned by the town, or once owned by the Sydney Water District. So yeah, it's really going through all those wells and determining what the town is actually responsible for and decommissioning the ones that we have no intention of ever using. So that would be what that project would be for.
Thank you. And so these would only be wells in the public, on public lands?
That's my understanding at this time, yes.
And so the reason the provincial regulations is basically a safety, it just improves safety if these wells are decommissioned?
That's my understanding as well.
Thank you. I'll turn to colleagues. Okay, thank you. I had a question with regards to review of library services on page 20. And the allocation is $20,000 in 2024. In staff considering the amount to allocate, was consideration given that the Sydney, this is the Sydney North Saanich branch of Viral, that to do a proper review of library services would perhaps require $40,000, and we would be looking to coordinate with North Saanich, or does staff feel that we could do some review of library services if Sydney was to initiate?
Well, I'm not entirely certain. I believe we are looking to do this somewhat jointly with North Saanich, and they would have their own funding, but that will be confirmed prior to 2024 when this item is brought forward again. It's possible that if that funding is in place, we might look late this year to get the ball rolling in terms of the planning with North Saanich.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, I think that fire department, additional full-time firefighter, might turn to, in 2024, turn to staff, turn to Chief Mickelson. Chief, can you please remind us why the timing of the additional firefighter in 2024, why not sooner, why not later?
This, to the mayor, what happened was that the firefighter that was the position that's vacant, actually the money was reallocated and used for our night staffing. So what this allowed us to do was to take those funds and implement our night staffing and our weekend staffing. And part of the financial plan was to allow sufficient time for that to play out. And then 2024 was pegged to fill that position. And the third deputy was pushed back to 2025. And I'll let Andrew make any other comments in respect to that as well.
Essentially, that is my understanding as well, but also the fire department has done very well at budget time over the last few years, and we do need to be a little cognizant of spreading out the funding a little bit, although we clearly are putting lots of resources into emergency management. I don't want to keep hitting up council with more and more money for these initiatives.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Keefe?
Thank you. While we're on the topic, I guess, of fire department, I didn't know if this came under operational budget or staffing, but I guess it's all related in regards to the additional resources. And I was grateful to the chief who provided some additional information in regards to, justification for these additional positions. And I think it's of note that, the total calls have dramatically increased over the last couple of years. I think it's close to 1,200 calls in 2022, which is double the amount from a couple of years ago. And also of note to me was the number of, more than half of those are medical emergency assistance calls. And I get a question through you to staff, perhaps the chief, in terms of, it seems that a good amount of our resources from emergency services are being used on these medical calls to support BC Ambulance because they don't have the capacity. And I'm wondering if you're seeing this in other jurisdictions around the province, and whether the possibility of doing any sort of cost recovery from the province is something that has been looked at.
Through the mayor to Councillor O'Keefe, yes, approximately 51% of our responses, what we call MESA calls, or Medical Emergency Services Assist, and that's through the First Responder Program. And the First Responder Program dates back to the early 90s, and the whole concept is that fire departments and stations are much more specific and numerous geographically than ambulance stations. So the idea is that firefighters could provide much more rapid initial treatment for life-threatening conditions. Over time, it's become problematic from a municipal context that it's become more, instead of being first on scene for 2 or 3 minutes, now sometimes we can be on scene for 35, 40 to over an hour, depending, waiting for an ambulance. That is typically not the case in Sydney, although 80% of the time we're first on scene. Quite often an ambulance arrives relatively soon after that, we'll say 5 or 10 minutes, but it's not uncommon to wait 20 or 30 minutes. In Vancouver or Surrey, it is very common for ambulances to wait 30, 40, 50 minutes, sometimes well over an hour. And those are for high acuity calls, and that's I would say the ambulance services condition is much more dire there than it is on the Southern Island. In respect to cost recovery, I work with the chiefs of Vancouver and Surrey, and I do believe that they will be and have pursued the concept of cost recovery with the province. I know it's been tried before, rather unsuccessfully, but I do know that is something that perhaps will be brought forward to UBCM or other avenues politically, particularly in the city of Vancouver. And it's probably best we just follow their lead, but I wouldn't hold out a lot of hope for that. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So I believe that concludes our supplemental requests. Mr. Hissick, did you want to proceed?
Thank you.
Can I suggest a short recess?
Yes, I'll call a recess until 8 p.m. Thank you. sorry, we're all back. We'll reconvene a minute early. Mr. Hissick? Okay, we will. Welcome back. We'll reconvene. Mr. Hissick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We've now reached our utility funds, and let's start with water and move on to sewer. So the water utility, as you know, is a distribution system, and essentially the largest expenditure is the bulk water purchase, and then there's the operation and maintenance of the distribution system. So it's funded with water parcel tax and user fees. The infrastructure levy parcel tax is not projected to change. The fixed charge remains the same. The consumption charge, we are planning to apply the same 5.08% increase to that as we received from the Saanich Peninsula distribution system. So we're essentially passing on the cost of water only, and that's part of our plan to make it a sustainable revenue source for the utility. So we did implement a new rate structure in 2021. It seems to be working exactly as we hoped. And once again, we're just passing on the direct cost of buying the water. And if council has any further questions about the utility, we're here to answer.
Thank you. So this is the water operating budget. I think I see people have turned to pages 50 to 52. Are there any questions of staff? Council, so what we normally do once if there are no questions with the operating budget and we're satisfied, we normally pass a motion to adopt the water operating budget.
I'll move adopt the water operating budget as presented.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. Mr. Hissick.
I didn't have any specific comments about water capital, but perhaps we can cover that as well. If it would be good to cover the entire utility so that we can.
Well, sewer operating is next in the binder, and then we could flip to the pages. And I mean, I think there's about 20 capital projects. I don't know if there's any questions on the water and sewer capital.
Okay, whatever council wishes.
Yeah, sewer operating.
So sewer, it's our share of the operation of the unified treatment plant and maintenance of the collection system. The review of the sewer rate structure is still on hold, pending staffing issues we are experiencing. We hope to get to it in 2024 for implementation the following year. Again, it's funded with a combination of parcel taxes and user fees. We are looking at a 3.7% user rate increase for this year. And if council is satisfied with the sewer budget, a similar resolution would be in order.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. I'll turn to questions first.
Oh.
Go ahead, Councillor Duff.
I'm just going to make the recommendation that we move forward with the resolution.
Second.
We have it moved and seconded to adopt the sewer operating budget as presented. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. And so the water capital and sewer capital were on pages 63 and 64 in our binders, Council. Mr. Hissick?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have anything further to add, but if there are any questions.
Okay, I'm just going to fast forward here. So I'll turn to colleagues if there are any questions on the 2023 water capital. There's 10 projects, and the sewer there is, there's 10 over the 23 to 2027 period and 15 for the sewer. slightly lesser number for 2023. Let's start with water. I do have a question through to staff. Looking at the meter replacement program, we see the budget is significantly higher in 2023 than following years.
We have been carrying forward unused funds from previous years and just adding it to the base 100. Just trying to use funding that's already been allocated to potentially supplement the program and get it advanced. So if we don't spend it, once again, it'll be moved forward. And as we do additional analysis on the meter replacement program, we hope to settle on a set amount eventually.
Thank you. If there are no questions, the motion would be in order to approve the water capital budget as presented.
Move approval of the water capital budget as presented.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Thank you. And the sewer capital. Councillor Rintoul?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Question through to staff, if I can, and so with respect to, I guess, pump stations, you'll recollect, council had heard from a member of the public with regard to, in his assessment, the failure of a pump station on Lochside, which led to some backup. I'm wondering if, in whether or not there's any allocation in here to address any capital improvements that may have been identified in relation to that item.
Ms. Cleary?
Sorry, through to Councillor Rintoul. That is a CRD pump station. That pump station's not owned and operated by the town. So it's, yeah, it's not something that we would make improvements to. That would be up to CRD.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mayor.
And will be raised at the CRD wastewater commission. It has in the past, but this is a new term and it'll be raised again. Thank you for the question. Seeing no further questions, a motion would be in order. Don't all rush.
I'll move approval of the sewer capital project.
Second.
Moved and seconded.
Budget.
Any further questions? Further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Thank you. Council, we've been meeting for just over 2 hours this evening. The next part of the budget for us to review is the capital budget, which is just over 100 projects, excluding the capital projects we've seen in the water and sewer capital. My suggestion to council, but I would turn to council for a consensus. I'm not sure we need a motion. For Mr. Hissick to perhaps go ahead and present his introduction to the capital budget, and that we adjourn for this evening and continue a discussion on the capital budget at next week's meeting. Councillor Keefe?
I think I would be inclined to get the presentation and then see how much of it we can get through till 9 o'clock. That would be my inclination, to try and get at least through some of it. If there's an opportunity that we didn't have to have a meeting next Tuesday, that would be great.
Okay, so am I seeing by nods we're comfortable going to 9 p.m.? Thank you. I'll turn back to Mr. Hissick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Total capital, as a reminder, for 2023 is 15.3 million, with the largest piece of that being the roundabout at 6.4 million. There is a variety of funding for the capital program, but what is often most immediate in council's mind is the current tax funding, which impacts the amount of this year's increase. The level of tax funding for 2023 is just over 245,000, which is up 93,000 over last year. And this level is much lower than it used to be a number of years ago, but mitigating that is that we are using more reserves and also setting more money aside in some of our reserves. So when we do get to looking at the capital budget in more detail, perhaps we can start with the 2023 tax funded capital and then look at other 2023 capital and then look at future years after that. And as is typical, any preliminary changes or reductions should be in the form of a resolution, as we have been doing all along. So, focusing first on the tax-funded 2023 capital, I have 2 slides on that. This one focuses on the annual and recurring projects. These are the items that come up each and every year, for which we set aside typically the same amount of funding. Any unspent funds from the previous year reduce the current year's funding to keep that annual budget at the anticipated level. There are also 2 projects that were carried forward for completion from last year down below, and perhaps the next slide is the one that will get more scrutiny because they are new items and not the recurring items that we typically accept. So in terms of new items for 2023 tax-funded capital, we have 3 RCMP initiatives which are cost-shared with North Saanich and the province. We have the refurbishment of a totem pole at Totem Park by the ferry terminal, and we have 4 smaller items as well.
Sorry, for clarification, Mr. Hissick, the Totem Park refurbish, is that not Wellness Park, not the ferry terminal?
No, there was a separate supplemental item for maintenance on that one. This is a more complete.
No, but I'm seeing the term refurbish.
Well, that's what we term it, but I think it's going to turn into more than that when it comes forward. It's a process that we'll have to report to council on in more detail once it gets budget approval, and we'll be bringing forward more detailed information as we have it. We are working with the Saanich Leadership Council on that.
Thank you. So I'll turn to Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. With regards to the totem pole by the Anacortes Ferry, and realizing the sensitivity around what's going to have to happen there, through you to staff, do we have any concerns from an engineering perspective of any risk that this might topple? I guess I've been at it a few times looking at it, and I'm not being an engineering expert, but I see it's in pretty bad shape, so I'm just more concerned about any kind of risks of it potentially falling over within the next short time frame.
Turn to Mr. Robinson.
Thanks, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Garnett. I think the risk is probably pretty low. It is a little bit of a photographic attractant, that's for sure. There's a lot of people that like to get their pictures taken by it. There is a little bit of rot inside the pole that we're starting to see. What I've been told through some of the experts that go into the restoration, if it stays in its natural environment, the longevity is great. If you take it, put it under cover, let it dry out, that's when sometimes the rot will turn to dry rot, and then the integrity of the pole itself can get lost. But it's well bolted at the base. You know, it would have to be vulnerable to the elements, a good wind throw or something like that in order to perhaps topple it over. That being said, it was installed in 1966, so it's got a healthy lifestyle behind it. And so what we're looking at is, again, to get clarification of the exact ownership of the pole. It was a provincial initiative back in the day. Back in the 90s, there was a suggestion that it would be nice for the local governments to take over maintenance of the pole. It was relocated at one point in time in the 90s, where the house that sat on that particular property is now the Arts Council building at Talista Park. So it's at that point in time where it needs a little bit of look at it. We did make contact with the carver a few years ago, and unfortunately he's passed away. Since then, with the reconciliation and dealing with the Wasatch leadership and the Arts and Council, it is not a Coast Salish pole. So again, proving who's responsible for the ownership of the pole. Might there be some other initiatives to return the pole or other issues? I think those conversations have to come forward. I doubt if that'll all come to fruition within a 12-month time period. But I think the emphasis is to try and get the process started as quickly as we can and see how it plays out. And be respectful of all the nations involved through the process.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Councillor Garrett?
That's why I'm just wondering if it's something that we can maybe remove from the budget, or do you want to keep it as a placeholder, or is it something that with the funds that are coming that we could? I'm just trying to think of, given how long it might take and the sensitivity around it, how your preference for proceeding would be.
Go ahead, Mr. Rees.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councillor Garnett, we believe it's important to get going on this, but I covered earlier that cutting $50,000 from our tax-funded budget would get us to under 5 for residential increase, and this is conveniently a $50,000 item. So my suggestion, if we don't find other reductions, would be to fund this project through the Capital Works Reserve for now, reduce the tax impact, and then should it be an eligible use of the upcoming grant funding, we could change the funding source for it later. But we would like to see this remain because we've been looking to deal with it for a number of years now, and it's important we get on it. It could be a couple of years, but we need to get on it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe, then Councillor Duck.
Thank you. A question through you to staff. Is the 5th Street medians landscaping?
Sorry, sorry. Are we finished on the totem? I don't know about the questions, so I'll just.
Sorry.
Sorry, we had questions with regards to the totem park totem, and I was just seeking if there were any further questions on that item.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Councillor Duck, did you wish to?
Yeah, I'd actually like to make a motion to remove it at this point, and as Mr. Hissick suggested that it could come out of other funding that we have, and I think it'd be appropriate to pull it aside right now and hold it in either the community grants fund or one of those other ones. Thank you.
Okay, before seeking a seconder, I'll turn to Mr. Hissick with a question. That is, in your answer to Councillor Garnett's question, you indicated a possible other source. Rather than removing it from the budget, we could pass an amendment on the funding source within the budget. I'll turn to Mr. Hissick for a comment before looking to a seconder or revised motion.
That is correct. If council is amenable to the idea, the motion would be to fund this project from the Capital Works Reserve instead of taxes.
So moved.
Second.
We have it moved in second. I'll turn to Councillor Duck to motivate, Councillor Rentoul and Councillor Duncan.
Well, I think Councillor Garnett really motivated in that respect is that there is work to be done, whether it can get done this year, and then Mr. Hissick's point of bringing this specific amount out of the tax-funded projects would help lower our taxes too. Thank you.
Councillor Rentoul?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. No, I'll concur with Councillor Duck's comments. Look, this keeps this project as a priority. It enables it to be funded in the current budget year, and it enables us and other tax-funded projects to look for some savings. And I'll acknowledge to having been a bit concerned, that we'd gone out with a 4.93% increase. But in effect, we heard this evening residents will be looking to pay 5.24% given the ratio between residents and commercial. And so I really like this initiative. Happy to support it. Thank you.
Councillor Duncan?
Thank you. I just had a question regarding the, source of the funding. The Capital Reserve Fund is what you suggested. Do we have like a public arts fund that's separate from the amenity reserve? I should know this, I should remember this. And if we did, this would not be an appropriate use of that fund, or?
Thank you, Councillor. We do not have a public arts fund, but public art is an eligible use of the amenities reserve. There just isn't enough balance in there at this time over the 5 years for me to recommend that source. It could
Yeah.
be replenished, but at this time we don't.
Yeah, thank you, that's why I was looking at it, saw it went into the red eventually, wondered if there was a separate one, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. So we have a motion on the floor. I won't support the motion. I understand, I appreciate the intent, but we have a budget or we have a tax increase that is significantly below inflation, and I think staff have recommended this funding, and we know that as Mr. Hissick addressed, I think in his very first presentation on the budget, we do have healthy reserves, but we need to maintain healthy reserves going forward, and I have a preference for leaving this in that reserve and with the funding source that staff recommended. Thank you. I'll turn to, seeing no other first-time speakers, I'll turn to Councillor Rintoul.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, in principle, I concur with your comments, but what I also heard from Mr. Hissick is that, you know, there may be an opportunity as we learn more about the community grant that we're receiving from the province to allocate funds. And so, despite the fact that we're providing direction this evening that this come from the Capital Works Reserve, what I heard from Mr. Hissick is that there's a possibility to revisit that throughout this fiscal year, and so we may not actually be utilizing those reserves when this project comes to fruition. Thank you. Unless unless Mr. Hissick wants to clarify what I heard.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul. I'll turn to Mr. Hissick and then Councillor Novak.
Councillor Rintoul, what you heard was correct. I fully expect this will be an eligible use of the anticipated funding. So while I truly appreciate the mayor's sentiment to maintain our reserves, I think if we approve this as a tax-funded item, we won't have the opportunity to reduce the tax impact when the rates come forward. I think if we reallocate the funding source at this time, we will not in fact be depleting that capital works reserve permanently, just until we have confirmation that the new grant funding will be an eligible use, if that's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. I'll turn to, sorry, Councillor Duncan, you did speak? No, I'll turn to Councillor Duncan, then Councillor Novak. I do have a list. Sorry, you don't need to speak. Okay, Councillor Novak.
I withdraw.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Myself opposed. The motion carries. Thank you. Any other items on this list? I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. A question through you to Mr. Hissick. I was also combing the list for tax-funded items, and one of the ones that caught my eye was 5th Street Medians Landscaping. Is that, I just wanted, but I didn't see it on your list.
Sorry.
Oh, there it is, down there.
Sorry, yeah, if maybe we could deal with one slide, agree we're finished with that slide and we'll go to the other. Sorry, I've just lost track of it. But that's okay, go ahead if it's on this slide.
Okay, so yeah, no, I hadn't seen it there, so I just wanted to clarify if, I just wanted to confirm that it was a tax-funded project.
It is.
Okay. Would it be appropriate to make a motion now if there's additional things that I want to?
So I'm going to stay with the list that's on the screen now. So if you have a motion pertaining to one of these items, please bring it forward.
I'll first another question through to Mr. Hissick. So initially I was going to make a motion that would call for some of these things to be funded out of the new fund, but I understand you don't want us, so the things that I'm looking at are mostly things to do with parks, which seem to be fit well with the new fund.
Sorry, just to clarify, I'm sorry for interjecting, but just to clarify, so if we can address any of the items on this screen, we do have a second screen, and then we'll be going to the remaining capital budget items that are not tax funded. So I'm not sure which, if you could speak to one item at a time?
Okay, my question though is, I'll do that one at a time, but I guess what I'm asking Mr. Hissick is, what would be the appropriate, if I'm going to identify some alternate fund, would it be community amenity fund, or is it suffice just to say in the motion to be funded from other reserves?
My best advice at this point would be, if we have a few smaller items that we wish to park for now by taking them out of taxes and waiting for confirmation of the provincial grant, we have a bit more capacity in capital works. I think that's where we could park it. However, I mentioned that $50,000 item because I realize the value of coming in under 5 to live up to our initial commitment. But as the mayor says, cutting too much will just make our phasing back to regular levels in future years more difficult. So please be careful how much we reduce this.
Right. So the Fifth Street medians landscaping is one that I thought we might be able to.
Sorry, is the
So-
Fifth Street median landscaping in this list?
Bottom.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't go to the blue. Fine, please proceed.
So my motion would be that the $25,000 for Fifth Street medians landscaping be taken out of tax funded and funded from other reserves?
Capital Works Reserve.
Capital Works reserves, okay.
Do we have a second? I'll call for a second time a seconder.
Second for discussion.
I'll turn to the mover and seconder.
So this seems something that would again help us bring the taxes down a little bit for this year. It also seems like something that would be able to ultimately be funded out of the new funds coming for the province. So it's just an attempt to bring our tax increase down a little bit more.
Thank you. I'll turn to the seconder. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan and then myself. Sorry, Councillor Duncan? No, sorry, Councillor Duck had no comment.
Thank you. I guess my question through to staff, this was a project, I believe a member of the public had identified as a question about why we would be doing it this year, given that we had the potential to put bike lanes on Fifth Street, and then therefore these might be removed altogether. And so I'm just wondering if staff could comment on whether it would be still worthwhile to do this, because I know this was something to decrease operational costs and for their maintenance, and whether it be still worth it based on that savings, and B, whether we would be likely to be removing these medians and with the active transportation plan, and whether staff has kind of taken that into account in the timing of this project now.
Thank you, Councillor. I think that comment was a bit premature. At this time, the plan is not to remove the median, but to remove potentially the parking along that corridor if the ATP actually proceeds as presented. And the detailed design has not been completed on that, so it's premature to say that we're going to remove the median for sure. So at this time, we feel comfortable moving ahead with this work, which will, for the time being, until that, if and when that happens, there will be operational savings and safety measures for our crew that are maintaining that median. Is there anything I've missed?
I would like to add that this is the second year of a 2-year plan as well, so half of it was done last year, and this is to finish off the rest of the median.
Okay, thank you. I'm honestly, whether this came out of capital or taxes, I still think I would just vote against this, because I don't know why we're continuing to try to lower taxes when our tax increase for this year is already quite low. our future year tax increases. We know we're going to be pretty high because we can't change the RCMP dispatch. And we know that we're going to have to be shuffling pretty hard to make sure we can still fund our infrastructure in addition to that. So I don't like putting things in a capital fund when there's really no impetus, like a dire need to lower the taxes by 0.25 percentage points. Slightly less than that at this time. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I won't support this motion. I think making reference to the new funding, that it can replace this reserve in a future date is just spending the money now. And I think there was a general consensus or appreciation from Mr. Hissick's presentation on that new provincial funding that let's wait for the staff to bring forward short-term, medium-term, long-term on that, and let's not reallocate it in effect by motions or actions such as this. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duck, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Garnett, myself, Councillor Rintoul, and Councillor Novick. The motion is defeated. Councillor O'Keefe, you did have the floor.
I'm done with this slide, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, if you can stay on that slide for a moment. Thank you.
Okay.
And so turning to this slide, are there any items for discussion?
We actually started with this one, but we can go back to it.
Okay, Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I had looked at the wildlife perch pole as a potential item, but I would really love to hear through you to staff, Mr. Robinson. Sorry, we seem to be having a back and forth today. Your expertise on whether you think this can be held off for a couple of years, of really something you'd rather see done this year.
Through the mayor to you, Councillor Garnett, I think it's something that we've been procrastinating on for a little while. Not only is it a great habitat perch pole, it's got a Wi-Fi hub on it, and also our iconic Frosty goes up there at Christmas time. Some of the issues is that we do have to climb that pole with spurs in order to maintain some of the things. So the integrity of the outer surface is starting to check, and it's becoming a safety issue for our arborists to climb. The actual replacement of the pole itself is a 60-meter treated hydro pole coming from the mainland is probably 40% of the cost, and then it's the dynamics of doing the craning and removing the old pole and doing that's going to recover the cost on it. But again, we're going to get another 15 plus years on a new pole in a new area. Again, it's not uncommon to see 2-3 eagles perched up on that pole on a given time, so it's got a lot of benefit for the community, and it's more of a precautionary issue from a safety perspective for the other uses that pole has in town as well.
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mayor.
Sorry, Mr. Robinson, sorry, did I hear or just catch that the pole might be relocated?
No, it'll just be removed. It's just
Okay.
Back in the day, you know, the optics at the time where the fishing pier and the park were built, it was a little easier to get access in there to set the pole up. It's going to be a little bit more challenging now to get in there, so there'll be a little bit of an engineering process and some crane work that's going to be involved in order to put that pole in place. So it's all doable for sure, but this year's probably the best time to get it done for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Garnett, you're good? Okay. Any other items on this list, Council? Seeing none, if I could go to page, sorry, I think after this, in order, Mr. Hissick, you had the remaining capital budget items? Yeah, the non-tax funded. So if we went to page 62, that is a complete list of the, on 62 and 63 of the 2023 capital projects, sorry. And some of those were the ones that we've just covered, but are there questions on any other capital items in this on these pages? Councillor Novick.
Yeah, if we're on these non-tax funded issues, I have a question about the ferry terminal marine structure for $330,000. I understand some of the issues here, the history. I've looked at the lease. My concern is we have a lease that is for all intents and purposes in default. And whether or not we've actually called the default or not remains to be seen.
I am going to interject for a moment. I think using the term default might be misleading, and I'd like to turn to Mr. Humble.
Fair enough.
No, I would agree. I don't think to suggest that the lease is in default is accurate. You know, we've heard from Washington State Ferries that they're not potentially going to be looking to resume the ferry service for at least 7 years, potentially. But the lease is still in place, and the discussion around the lease still has to happen between staff and Washington State Ferries, and subsequently then we would look to have a discussion with council regarding Washington State Ferries' intention around the lease. So it is still in place, and until, quite frankly, we hear otherwise from Washington State Ferries, you know, we'll assume that it's still moving forward. So certainly not in default at this stage. Thank you.
Mr. Humble. I'll turn to Mr. Hisik before going back to Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I did have this slide on the ferry terminal capital projects. Maybe you would like me to cover these before further.
If you're okay with that, Councillor Novick? Okay.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we heard about the recent announcement that they're not likely to return until 2030 at the earliest. We have to take them at their word, barring any political process south of the border. There are two capital projects in the budget related to the terminal. One is major maintenance on marine structures. The other is replacement of the U.S. Customs building for the cross-border pre-clearance initiative. So the Customs building project will be essentially put on hold until assurances are received. So that is not going to proceed. It's, I believe, $1 million spread over a couple of years. We may do a little bit of additional design work on it to take it to a place where it's ready to go, but essentially it's on hold. Now the major maintenance on the marine structures, it's going to be limited to essential work only at this time. It's $330,000 in the budget, but so far we anticipate on moving forward with only $80,000 to maintain the integrity of the structure. Because we don't know what's going to happen. We need to make sure that facility is ready for any and all potential marine uses, and we won't do any work that is not essential for that purpose. And just as a reminder that all the work so far has been and is planned to be done with funds received from Washington State lease payments. So essentially we're playing with house money here. We have not put our own tax dollars into it. So assurances that we're not doing anything that isn't critical at this time, and council will have a more complete report about options and a chance to weigh in on those options. We anticipate sometime in the spring. But there's a lot of investigation work still to go for an eventuality that came up essentially a week ago.
Thank you, Mr. Hisik. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit just for clarity, and that is there's the two line items in the budget. The ferry marine structures, $330,000, and the ferry terminal building improvements, $50,000. You've outlined them here. So you indicated that the ferry terminal building improvements would be put on hold, and that approximately 80,000 of the 330,000 would be important maintenance to maintain the infrastructure.
That's correct at this time. There was a tender out for the remainder of the 330, but we were able to pull that with no consequences at that time, and we'll revisit once we have more information.
And both that $330,000 funding and $50,000 funding come out of the ferry terminal reserve, which is
that's correct.
Which is has income from the Washington State ferry lease. Thank you. Councillor Novak, I'll turn back to you as you initiated the question.
Well, thank you. That makes a big difference in my mind. 330,000 is a far cry from 80,000. A little more amenable to seeing 80,000 being spent as a stopgap measure until we are able to determine the outcomes of discussions with Washington State Ferries. If that's the case, would you be modifying these numbers so that our totals are more in accordance with what you're suggesting?
There is no need to amend the budget. We can simply decide not to spend it, and then when we consider next year's budget, we'll have different numbers coming forward. Just because it's in there doesn't mean we have to spend it. If we know we're not doing it, maybe we'll modify, but again, there's no harm in having it there as an opportunity, because we may decide further down the road this year that we do need to undertake more maintenance, and this will give us the opportunity to do so.
Fair enough. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Novak. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I guess just, sorry, Mr. Hissick, question. This ferry, is this the reserve, the money comes from the ferry lease, and so it's all money that Washington State has, provided for the maintenance of their facilities.
Mm-hmm.
Is it in a separate reserve that's earmarked specifically for this terminal, or is it mixed in with the rest of our capital funds such that in the event we ended up, they essentially mothballed this and we, put it on care and maintenance and had extra money in that reserve?
Mhm.
Is that something that is like income that they have paid, essentially as rent that we would be capable of using as capital later, or is that money, it goes to that ferry terminal and that's what that reserve's for and nothing else?
Thank you, Councillor. While the lease is in effect, those funds must be maintained for purposes of taking care of the ferry terminal property. In the unlikely event that the lease is terminated, it is a town capital reserve, and we would have the ability to redirect it through bylaw amendment, but not until the lease is no longer in effect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. I share Councillor Novak's concern about this. I even have reservations about spending the $80,000 until council has an opportunity to discuss whether we want to maintain a facility or not. There's questions that I have about the lease that maybe are more appropriate for an in-camera meeting. The fact that $80,000, even though it comes from Washington State Ferry Reserve, it's still our money. And so if we go on and spend that, and if at some point council decides, that there's no future there, I have concerns that we've just wasted $80,000. So I'll try out a motion and we'll see how this goes. I would say that no further expenditures be made on the Anacortes Ferry Wharf and Terminal until council has an opportunity to discuss the future of the terminal.
Second for discussion.
Moved in second. I'm going to turn to before going to the mover and seconder, I'll turn to Mr. Humble.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I'd allude to the fact that there needs to be a level of discussion between staff and staff from Washington State Ferries about what their view is with respect to the lease. And so staff are in the process of looking to try to arrange those discussions. I think that, and we don't have a specific timeline in terms of how long those discussions may take, the number of discussions that may be involved with respect to this. So in terms of coming back to council and having a potential detailed discussion on how to move forward, what the approach is around the lease, etc. That's going to take some time, and Mr. Hisik indicated potentially spring. Well, it could be spring, it could be summer. I don't know. It's going to take some time. This is a new project, quite frankly, that now we're faced with. Councillor Garnett mentioned earlier about capacity and staff resources. I can tell you that this is a significant occurrence, and it will have an impact with respect to other strategic priorities, because it's going to take some time to work this through. So I just think from a staff perspective, we own the terminal. This is expensive infrastructure, and so the concept of not doing the bare minimum maintenance on that infrastructure, from a staff perspective, we have concerns with that, and we think it's short-sighted not to proceed with that. So, thank you.
I'm not going to make the ruling now, but I'm going to consider making the ruling that this is an inappropriate motion. And my grounds, and I'm going to turn to Mr. Hisik, is that Mr. Hisik has indicated, Mr. Humble has indicated, that we have an active lease in place with Washington State Ferries. The terms of that lease are to 2031. Mr. Humble also indicated that in the discussions that were with Washington State Ferries, and I was on the call last week, is that there was no discussion of the lease. That we were receiving the announcement with regards to the new timing, the delayed timing in reinstatement of this run. This run is still, the Anacortes to Sydney run is still in the Washington State ferry route reinstatement plan until such time that the parties, the Town of Sydney and Washington State Ferries, decide otherwise. Mr. Hisik has indicated that under the lease we are obligated to maintain the infrastructure to a certain level as per the terms of the lease. So I'll turn to Mr. Hisik, and then before making a ruling, based on the answer, I may turn to Councillor O'Keefe. Mr. Hisik.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You summarized it well. We do have obligations, and clearly we have pulled back on some of those obligations by pulling the tender. We would ask that council at this time have a little bit of trust in the dedicated, experienced professional staff who do not spend money frivolously and are making this recommendation with a lot of thought, and perhaps just follow our advice on this one.
So rather than going through the process of ruling it out of order, I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe in a second, or if they would consider withdrawing the motion. If not, we will we will proceed. Councillor O'Keefe.
I'm somewhat, I have reservations. However, I'm willing to give the staff some latitude. If we're limiting the funds to $80,000, I think I could live with that, as long as we're not spending the whole $330,000. And I think it's important. I recognize there's a lot to do here, but I think that council needs the opportunity to weigh in at some time, hopefully in the spring, in terms of the future here. Thank you.
So is that, you do withdraw? Sure. I will turn to the seconder.
Yes, I concur, and I'm thankful for the additional information that was provided by staff, because that gives more clarification. Thank you.
Thank you to the mover and seconder. The motion is removed from the floor. Is there any further questions on the ferry terminal topic? Seeing none, I'll turn to colleagues if there are questions on any other items within the capital budget that we haven't yet addressed. Councillor O'Keefe?
Thank you. So they're capital items to do with parks, and some of them are in 2023, and some are 2024 and 2028. And a question through you to staff is in regards to the parks, I think they're called shade structures or shelters, and there's 50,000 allocated for Iroquois Park, 50,000 for Talista, I think those are in 2024, and Rathdown Park for 50,000 in 2028. And what I'm wondering is, because due to the, climate change and the hot summers are becoming more of an issue, I think it would be a good idea if we can to move up the construction of those to 2023, especially knowing that we have additional funding coming. I'm also wondering whether there might be some efficiencies in terms of being able to send out one tender for 3 projects. So one tender, less administration, perhaps getting a better deal if we're doing 3 rather than 1 at a time. So just staff's comments on that.
I'll turn to Mr. Hisik first.
Maybe I'll take the first crack at this one. There are certain projects like those specifically where once the grant eligibility has been ascertained and we've had a chance to consider the capacity issues that were mentioned earlier, we would look forward to bring forward a report to council on potential uses of some of that provincial grant money, and knowing which of these future year projects might be on council's radar for advancement would be useful, but those can also be added when we report back to you.
Okay.
So it is possible to add projects to the budget that are not tax funded at a later juncture this year. And I think when we come forward with a more complete report on how that money can be spent and when, that'll be another opportunity for council to potentially advance some of these initiatives, capacity being available.
Thank you, Mr. Hisik. Councillor O'Keefe?
Okay. That sounds good. So if you're interested in some other ones, I have one more. So in terms of Breather Park, and there's going to be some design and some work on that. What I'm wondering is about the surface for the park and the accessible play structures. And I know that the plan is to use engineered wood chips, which is considered accessible, but what we're starting to find out now that that's not really the case. If you check with the Rickanson Foundation, they acknowledge that although a lot of manufacturers will tell us that engineered wood chips are an accessible.
Councillor O'Keefe, if I might interject, I appreciate the explanation. I will let you continue, but I have a suggestion, and that is, and it's a question I actually have, but you came to this item first, is would staff, similar to other park improvements that I've had, we realize smaller park improvements are operational items that staff proceed with, but this looks to be a $200,000 item. Would the park design come forward to council once further design work is done? And that might be the more appropriate time for questions. But I'll seek an answer to that first.
Yeah.
There are certainly some elements of the larger projects that will have additional process around them, especially future year projects. So we took our first crack at the parks master plan, the first 5 years worth of projects, but we do plan on coming forward at some point this year, time permitting, with a more complete look at the remainder of that plan, and that'll give a chance for council to do a bit of prioritization, reprioritization, and this kind of tweaking. So perhaps that would be a better time than at budget time.
For a question of that type?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll turn to you, Councillor Keefe.
Okay, that's fine. I was just wondering if there was going to be additional funding required to have more accessible surface, whether we had to include that now, but it sounds like that can wait for further discussions. So I'm happy with that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Did you have another item, Councillor O'Keefe?
No, that's good for me.
Okay, thank you. Turning to colleagues, any other items? I do have a few. The second item, the asset management plan budgeted for $110,000 this year, $65,000, I believe, next year. and there's a description of it in the larger page further in the budget. Is that referring to it as a management plan? We have a climate action plan, we have a parks master plan, and major initiatives come forward. When this work is completed in 2 years, would the asset management plan come forward to council for information?
There are definitely certain elements of the plan that will have to come forward for policy decisions. I can't commit at this time to exactly how much or which elements, but as the plan is completed, we will, I anticipate there will be a few junctures where we have to come forward for policy decisions, and ultimately it'll be a service level question as well, which council will have to weigh in on in terms of choices between paying X for this level of service and paying Y for perhaps a level, lesser or even a higher level.
Thank you. My next question is with regards to parks vehicles and transportation vehicles. I pretty much ask this question on an annual basis, and I do appreciate the response from staff. There is 125,000 out of reserves for parks vehicles and 390,000 for transportation vehicles, also out of reserves. But are there are opportunities increasing to go to EV for some of our fleet as time progresses?
Thank you, to you, Mr. Mayor. Certainly our parks vehicles, we're looking at 2 of our larger turf tractors this year. A lot of those are coming out in hybrid models now, where you can either get full electric or partial electric for the cutting power and things like that. So that's our intent this year, is to look at all those different options that are available to us and see what we can do with that. Again, the larger equipment, certainly the electric technology is a little bit behind times. The supply chain issues and everything, we're looking at tenders that we're putting out this year. We're getting called back from manufacturers saying, you know, we're looking at delivery dates that are pushing out over 18 months. It's going to be a challenge for us to hold a price in today's value, not knowing what they're going to be when they deliver a good in 18 months. So we've got some tenders in process right now, anticipating what our needs are going to be, knowing that there is a level of urgency in order to try and get in line for manufacturing, things like that. But certainly if we get pushback that our tenders are coming in above what we've anticipated our expenditures to be, we'll probably have to come up with other strategies on that. But we are looking at everything. We're looking at used items, auction available equipment, different opportunities like that. But certainly brand new equipment is a difficult thing to come by, and a difficult thing for manufacturers to schedule at this point in time. We're extremely lucky with the 2 unique pieces that we bought, the sweeper and the hydro excavator, 2 of our most expensive units. We managed to get those in before the pandemic hit and put quite a crash on those things. Some of those materials are, again, the prices of those things and the delivery dates are basically unknowns at this time. So we're going to try our best. We're going to look at every option that we have, and potentially auction used or other technologies might be something that we'll look at. And certainly we maintain our equipment at such a level that there's not an urgency. We haven't had any catastrophic breakdowns. If we have to service and maintain and maybe spend a little extra in maintenance to increase the longevity of something until maybe technology improves or supply chain issues are resolved, we've got the option to look at that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. I think Councillor O'Toole, do you have a follow-up? Different item?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you again. Councillor O'Toole, I'll turn to you if you have an item. I do have a couple of more, but.
Thank you, Mayor. With respect to funding the $250,000 with Peninsula Soccer and the turf field, could you just provide some guidance on when you would like to see some suggestion of the type of documentation or funding agreement that could go to accompany funding of this nature? So I know for example, the town has agreements with a number of nonprofit organizations to have some accounting for expenditures, et cetera. What would staff anticipate seeing from council in conjunction with this budget request to ensure there's that sort of reporting and feedback from Peninsula Soccer?
Thank you, Councillor. So the first question I heard was when. My preference would be not right now. But in terms of putting a funding agreement together, we have one that's coming forward for Mary Winspear Centre. We'll be working on one for Peninsula Streams. So it seems to be a direction we are heading in. So staff will bring forward any agreements for these larger contributions that council would like to see. So perhaps a resolution at this time, if that is council's wish, to perhaps have that kind of funding agreement for those external requests, being this one and also the school district, the track request. But those agreements would come forward to council for approval, and if you're not happy with what staff bring forward, then you will have a chance to weigh in at that time.
So a motion to those two projects to, for staff to pursue funding agreements.
Sure.
And we understand that they would come forward to council. We don't have to give direction to them.
And if I may ask, because my understanding of this undertaking was it was somewhat contingent on financial support from at least one other municipality, potentially two other municipalities. What does the process look like if that funding doesn't materialize through those municipalities' budgeting processes?
Thank you, Councillor. Good question. I am aware now that Central Saanich has provided funding. We have access to their staff report. We'll probably steal their ideas for a funding agreement from that report. North Saanich, I do not have confirmation yet that their previously allocated funding has been approved, but I hope to get that shortly. But it would be easier for us to say that our own funding is contingent on certain parameters being met, and that could include that funding being in place. But obviously I would have a hard time recommending that we give them the money before we have the right assurances about the project going forward.
Thank you. Agreed. And I think unless you would disagree, perhaps that's something that could be addressed within this funding agreement documentation as the assurities, that they've got the other funding support and the projects are moving forward. And if that meets with your approval, then I would be prepared to move a motion at this time in the nature you suggested.
And if I may, just for clarity, that that would be indicated that given the level of funding that Central Saanich Council provided at their last meeting, that we're looking to provide tonight, and the level that North Saanich is considering providing, is that it would be for both turf fields to go forward. Given the presentation that we received and the level of funding that's been requested from the three municipalities is to proceed with both fields. So if for some reason they weren't able to proceed with both fields, I think, and we're providing this level, I think we need to have some further discussion, because that's our understanding what the funding will contribute to.
Well, and my understanding from Mr. Hissick's response is that would be addressed in this.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that it would be two fields and not one. So, okay, thank you. Are staff comfortable with what the appropriate wording for that is?
We believe we can handle it, but what I'm hearing is that should this item be approved, council would want a funding agreement in place, and part of that agreement would stipulate that it would be two fields, and that the other partners both commit funding that's been requested of them. Am I hearing anything?
I think that the two fields are moving forward is sufficient. I just, anecdotally, Peninsula Soccer has continued to increase their fundraising efforts, and so I don't know what the dynamics are with regards to funding, but if they've been able to bring together the funding necessary to proceed with the 2 fields, then.
Well, as a point of clarification, what I heard is that the funding agreement would come back to council at some point, so we'd see it, and be able, I think, to further address that if necessary, so.
Okay, yeah, I think there's an understanding there, so if council is comfortable, we have it moved, and do we have a second?
Second.
We have it moved and seconded, any further discussion?
Okay, sorry, with respect to the motion,
Yeah.
as, to clarify, my intent would be that a funding agreement be entered into with Peninsula Soccer Association, for their project, as well as with SD 63 for the, track, project as well.
Thank you for that clarity.
Second to both.
That's, okay, and further discussion? Seeing none.
Just,
Oh, go
just
ahead,
clearly, just clearly to state that I recognize the town has agreements with a number of the nonprofits that we work with. These are 2 very new requests. They're large amounts of money. I think the spirit around the council table is very supportive of these undertakings, and I think it's just a matter of due diligence for us to enter into these new funding agreements with these new partners. Thank you.
Thank you, council. I'll turn to Mr. Hissig before calling the question.
Thank you. I heard those comments, and given the amount and nature of requests coming forward for significant amounts of funding, it could be time for us to come up with a draft policy for council's consideration for when a certain, what threshold we should set for putting a funding agreement in place.
Thank you, Mr. Hissig. I'll call the question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. You still have the floor, Councillor O'Toole?
Thank you. I'll yield.
Thank you. The item, Ray Creek pedestrian bridge, with North Saanich, funded at 60,000, coming from reserves. I think there's an understanding in the larger description that's provided within the budget that the intention is for that project to move forward and or complete in 2023.
That is our understanding.
Thank you. The item, the Public Works Administration building design, $25,000 in this budget, and I'm going to turn to the wording in the larger description, so it's under PWG 1603. So it says under the description that a conceptual drawing for the reconfiguration of the Public Works Administrative Offices, the existing offices were created by joining several portable trailers together many years ago. The modular buildings were previously used by the RCMP in the 1970s. And so it's a budget of $25,000 for design. And then a following statement is a 2012 preliminary seismic assessment of the entire Public Works building. So that would be the building that the administrative offices are a part of. Indicated more than $1 million would be required to bring the building up to the then 2006 BC building code. So we realize things may have changed. So I just want to clarify that the intent is while the entire building that includes the administrative offices may require seismic upgrading, or we want to move forward with that. At this time, the design is only for the admin offices, and following that, it might come back at a future time to just do the administrative offices, or is it more practical to be doing the entire building at some point?
Perhaps I can begin the response and let my colleagues weigh in if they wish. This is specifically looking at a particular component of the overall building. We do have the civic sites analysis that will be coming forward later this year, which perhaps may not focus initially on the Public Works building, but eventually a phase of that project will. And I think at that time we'll have a better idea about our plans for the entire facility. At this time it's probably premature because we haven't done that analysis. If there's anything
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just conceptually, it's kind of an idea of a placeholder. Certainly, the building where the administration office is, the mechanic shop, the carpentry shop, and the utilities portions, they've all been cobbled together over the years. There's probably 3 or 4 different phases put together in there. Lunchroom facilities, washroom facilities, shower facilities, all that kind of stuff is archaic and has just been an add-on over the years. So the idea is to have a look at it, potentially with a placeholder there. Perhaps we could come up with some sort of a shelf-ready conceptual design that would put a number at a target of something that we might want to look at a future date. I believe an example is, I think Saanich is looking at for their public works rebuild at around 70 million for 400 staff and that kind of thing. I don't think we're anything in that ballpark, but certainly to get an opportunity to look at all the different features and all the amenities that might be coordinated and needed to run the facility for the utilities and everything that we else, I think is worthwhile looking at. These other studies that are going to come in together, it's going to give us an opportunity to come up with a robust plan, perhaps have a shelf-ready design that's quite functional and meets our needs into the future, and then look at the potential for funding sources further out.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson, and thanks to Mr. Hissick for bringing in the asset management, the facilities management plan as is in our strategic plan. The next item I have is the benches for downtown streets, 20,000. It indicates that would purchase, I believe, 10 benches, and the intention would be that those benches, it's of benefit to purchase them in bulk rather than one at a time, as it indicates in the report. But they would be going to new developments. A question is are we budgeting from time to time to replace benches that are not part of, in other parts of the downtown that are not part of new development?
Through to Mayor, the intention of these would be cost recoverable for developments, so that they're matching the existing benches. The existing benches can be powder coated if they do start to wear. At this time we don't have any new budget proposals for new benches that aren't related to developments.
Thank you. The north-south bike lanes, 360,000 from reserves, but in the 2023 budget. So of course that is part of the active transportation plan. It does make reference in the larger description within the budget that is subject to the active transportation plan being approved. We know it's out for public engagement at the moment, and that all of the public engagement will come back to council along with the future staff report, and council will make determination what that final active transportation plan looks like. If we were to approve the active transportation plan with the 2 cycling corridors that these funds would be going to, and I believe would be the first 2 priorities as they were prioritized in the active transportation plan, that in essence approving them within this budget through this process we're in tonight, and then approving the active transportation plan, they would go forward. I mean, we understood, I guess, through the presentation of the active transportation plan, and I realized we had the consultant, presenting that, the budgeting for the elements of the active transportation plan is a 10-year plan, proposed to be a 10-year plan, and that it would be coming forward maybe with further design work at each stage for council consideration. So is there appreciation of my question in there?
I think so. It's so this is predicated on the plan being approved, and having the funding in place will allow us to do the intended purpose, which is address the north-south corridor. But I anticipate that when the plan does come forward, there will be some kind of a sober second thought opportunity for council to make sure that what we have in place and what we're planning to do is in fact the priority for council. And perhaps that'll be fleshed out through the ATP itself, or perhaps separately as a follow-up once that's approved.
Thank you. I could have I'll rephrase the question a little differently, and that is that we are receiving lots of public feedback, and that's a good thing. But that is without the detailed design. And we know from the public open house, for example, that we attended, that there are questions about design, and it's reasonable to explain now that detailed level of design. But I think the general public might have an appreciation that there would be an opportunity to further comment when detailed design was done.
Yes, Clary.
That is the intent, that the major projects would, well, depending on the level of impact, they may be more focused engagement, like we do for many of the sidewalk projects or road projects. The community members who live along those corridors are contacted in some way. Or for some of the more impactful ones, we would do a broader engagement approach for them.
Thank you very much. Councillor? Yes, I'm going to a next item. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Go ahead.
I'm inclined, I'll just look to see if there may be some support to defer this to 2024, and I make that suggestion on the basis that I think spending $360,000 on detailed designs, in this year probably is not going to meet with the expectations of the community, given that we're kind of midstream in this consultation process. So I'll look to see if there may be support for a motion of that nature, or I'm happy to make it if you prefer me to do that.
Sorry, I'm going to seek a clarification through staff. Sorry, is the 360,000 solely for design?
No.
I know I could turn to the page,
No.
but I've read it once, so.
Approximately 60,000 is to complete the design, which has already started, and 300,000 is set aside for initial construction.
And so staff, well, it's in the budget, so staff believe that given the timeline process we are to approve the active transportation plan, that would be feasible to move forward with this as design and construction in 2023 would dictate.
We can't move ahead if there's no budget in place, so
Yeah, okay.
having it there gives us the opportunity, should everything align.
So to clarify, because I'm looking at page 170, the reference I see to construction is only the wording construction to follow if supported by ATP. Is there another page I should be looking at?
Nope.
Okay, so where it says contracted services, the 320K would refer to the construction, contract and award of construction work. Is that the intent?
Just to clarify, this used to be broken out into two different budget years. 60,000 was in 2022 for the design of the north-south corridors, and the 300,000 was to be used in 2023 if the active transportation plan was adopted for construction. So although the wording here doesn't quite clarify that, but construction would only proceed if the plan was adopted. And so yeah, this used to be two different budget years: design in the first year, construction in the second year. And it's been combined, and the description appears to have been combined as well.
Just for clarification, I'll turn back to Councillor O'Toole, but we've heard from staff earlier this evening that there is more detailed design work to be done. Okay. So I realize design work was done in 2022. That is, I guess, contained within the current draft active transportation plan, but more detailed design is required.
Correct. So there was some preliminary design done on certain corridors that thought may be feasible for north-south corridor. Some of those were found maybe not to be as feasible as once thought. So that is why the draft active transportation plan was presented as it is. And so this plan has kind of already, if you remember, it used to be called Rest Haven Bike Lanes, this project. So it's already warped, this project, and it will continue to evolve as the active transportation plan is adopted. I believe we would proceed with whatever the priority project from the final plan, whether that be this north-south corridor or some other corridor. That would be the intention. So it'd be to keep this in, it will allow us to start working on whichever project ends up being the priority.
Thank you.
So if
I'll
I
turn
could
back to
just
you, Councillor Ronson.
clarify, my read of this, and I'm not sure, beg your pardon, it was Mr. Hisik or Ms. Clary, where I got the impression that this is spread over a couple of years. I'm looking at page 63, capital projects. It's showing $360,000 in 2023. It's not showing that amount spread.
It started in 2022. So this is
Okay.
the second year of it.
Okay, so I might be getting a little tired to the point where things don't make as much sense to me, but to me right now, I don't wanna see $360,000 in the 2023 budget for this line item. So I'll reserve the right to come back to this at our next meeting, or, you know, obviously there's more discussion tonight, but I'm gonna tap out on it for right now, knowing that I'm gonna circle back to it.
Okay, so, a comment and then I'll turn to Councillor Garnett first. Councillor Garnett?
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to staff. So if in the context of the ATP plan coming back to priorities, just wanting clarification, if cycling lanes do not become a priority, but there are other priorities in terms of pedestrian, can those funds be used for that, or do they specifically for some kind of cycling corridor?
They can be redirected based on the outcomes of the ATP that's ultimately approved by council. So all I would say to finish perhaps this discussion is, unless council has no intention to spend any money on ATP, I would suggest leaving this in, knowing that nothing will move ahead until council's comfortable with it.
Thanks. That's great clarification. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor.
Point of order.
Yes.
We had targeted 9 p.m. as our ending point. We're now at 9:20, just to get an indication of how much later we're going to go, or if we should take a recess. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Duck. We didn't do it by resolution, so that's why I didn't ask for a motion to extend, but it should be raised because we are past that hour. I only have a couple of questions myself to continue with, so I think from my standpoint, we'd feel, I realize a couple of other members have jumped in with other items, so it looks like we're getting close because the capital budget is the last, capital budget is the last part of the budget for us to approve. And if we don't make any further amendments, we would be passing a motion to approve the capital budget this evening and not have the meeting scheduled next week. So I would seek some flexibility with council that we perhaps go the next 10-15 minutes and see where we are there. But if we get into another item that requires substantial discussion, we will go to a next meeting. And I've already used time up.
Just to point to that, just back to Councillor O'Toole, would you be bringing back your comments later or at another meeting?
Yeah, if the consensus is that we keep going, I will revisit that item and put something forward. I'm just not sure what it is at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we're tabling that item, not officially, but for the moment, until Councillor O'Toole wants to come back to it. Are there any, I'll turn for one last time if other council members have, I'm not seeing anything. With regards to bike racks, so both in the miscellaneous active transportation improvements at 30,000 and in bike racks and 10,000, the bike rack line item is a continuation of the program that's been in place, which is 50-50 cost shared. But bikes are referred to within the miscellaneous active transportation plan. Have staff given any consideration to, sorry, it's getting late, I need to find my words, is protect bicycle parking?
Sorry, are you referring to the miscellaneous active transportation improvements at this
Well,
time?
well, just yeah, within the active transportation, or as staff given consideration, and it might come forward in a future budget, appreciating that these, $35,000 initiatives are here this year.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely in consideration. It will be considered as part of the active transportation plan as well, so that will be something brought up through that plan. It's not something that is in the works to do this year, but it is definitely on our radar.
Thank you. Mr. Isaac.
If it gave council any comfort, we could rename the north-south corridor to ATP priority projects, and that would perhaps leave it more open-ended for things like what you just mentioned, Mr. Mayor, or anything else that might come out of the approved ATP.
Okay. Councillor O'Toole?
If I may comment on that, if that means that the $360,000 that's requested here wouldn't be specifically with reference to, you know, bikes within the ATP or bike lanes, and it could include the pedestrian improvements that may come out of this, then I'd be very content to see money stay in the 2023 budget for active transportation. My concern is with the type of feedback we received to this point, allocating that much money specifically for north-south bike lanes. So if that's the intent of your statement, Mr. Hisik, I would be happy to leave it in as a renamed fund.
I'll turn to staff. Do we need a motion to rename?
So moved.
I'll make that motion. that we just-
Second.
Let me just hand you the keys. Okay, there's consensus that will happen. Thank you. The last item I'm just trying to turn to here. Sorry, I have two items. One is the bus stops, and forgive me, I just haven't turned to that page, and if I did, I'm not recollection. Can staff just speak to the intention of the bus stop line item?
Through to the mayor, this is a program, BC Transit funds the bus stop shelters, and the town is responsible for pouring the pad and building the pad that it's on. So this helps fund the town's portion of that work.
And BC Transit identifies the priorities?
No, the town works with them to do that. We do have one lined up to do this year of a shelter that was damaged, and so we're replacing that shelter. But we do have a number of them that have higher ridership, and that's how we kind of pick those locations.
Thank you. My last question is back to the active transportation plan, and it's not about the cycling corridors, it's about the sidewalk improvements. So we do see within the budget, we haven't had any discussion, but we see them every year, sidewalk improvements, and they are significant. I didn't add them up, I sometimes do that. But are there any sidewalk, they're not identified in the budget as far as I could tell, that they would be first year initiatives of sidewalk improvements in the active transportation plan? Or are they? It's a question.
I'll take a first crack if that's okay. We bring forward sidewalk projects every year as part of the 5-year plan. I think we continued to do that. We realize some of them might dovetail into the ATP, and some that are scheduled for future years will be reprioritized based on the ATP. But they are part and parcel of the same overall plan.
Thank you. And I'll rephrase my question or follow up, and that is we have allocated substantial sums for bicycle lane priorities. We haven't allocated a sum for sidewalk improvement priorities, other than staff have brought sidewalk improvement priorities in the capital plan, but they're not identified as being those priorities that are in the active transportation plan. The active transportation plan specifies, and I'm forgetting the number, but it's a significant number of sidewalk improvements. So we're doing it for bicycle lanes, but I'm not seeing it in the budget with regards to the sidewalk improvements that are projects that are identified in the ATP.
At this time, the ATP isn't worked into the budget. Really, just the north-south corridor was a relic project, I'd say. It started out as the Rest Haven bike lanes before the ATP was even out to tender, and so that project is still in the budget. There are a number of sidewalk projects in here, like Galaran Road, for example, is the big project we're doing next year. However, all the new priorities from the ATP have not been worked in. They will be brought forward through next year's budget process.
Thank you. And I appreciate that from the standpoint that staff look at the financial resource, but they also look at the staff resource, and you know, this is an ambitious capital program, as it is each year. So I appreciate the distinction between the cycling corridors being in the budget and the ATP sidewalk, not at this time, and not until 2024. That concludes my questions on the capital budget. So if there are no questions further from colleagues, we could have a motion to approve the capital budget.
So
Sorry,
moved.
sorry, there are sorry,
Yeah.
as amended.
Yeah.
I've identified 2023 projects, some were carryover. I didn't go to capital projects beyond, and that's intentional because each year we have the opportunity to have the more detail provided by and discuss them at that time.
I'd like to make the motion to move the capital budget as presented.
As amended.
No, amended, sorry. That's what I meant to say.
We have that
Second.
moved and seconded by Councillor Garnett. Any further discussion? I just want to, because I know people, as soon as we adjourn, will be off and running, and I just want to thank Mr. Hissick in particular, but thank all of staff, all of senior staff for their input and the work that Mr. Hissick acknowledged at the beginning of the meeting. It certainly makes our role on council a lot easier with the budget presentation in the binder and the budget presentations we've had at each of the meetings, and the answers to our questions that we asked both outside of the meeting, but many of the questions we asked, all of the questions we asked this evening. So,
Okay.
so I will call the question on approval of the capital. But unless you had a comment, I'll call the question, Mr. Hissick.
On the capital, I have a comment afterwards, if you
Sure.
wouldn't mind.
All those in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you, Mr. Hissick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If you're thinking of adjourning, I would like to point out just one thing. We haven't actually, I neglected to bring up whether council had any questions about the operating budget. We do not have a resolution on that yet.
Sorry, thank you. And there is, I actually do have another item elsewhere in the budget, but, so we began with operating budget, but what we did was we began with the 30-some odd supplemental, but there are other line items, and those are presented in the pinkish green or pinkish yellow pages right near the beginning of the budget. I think there's 3 pages. Do council members, just so we cover process and then make a resolution, do council have any questions? And if not, we would need a motion to approve the operating budget as amended.
I'll move to approve the operating budget as amended.
Second.
We haven't moved and seconded. Any further discussion? If there were amendments made, they're covered. My memory is not serving me well from do we make some amendments on the supplemental items?
There were a couple, there were
Yeah,
a
and
couple
and
of
those
things.
supplemental items are part
Yeah.
of the general operating budget. All in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Thank you. I do have a question, and that is I'm going to go to the second last page in the binder, which is the Town of Sydney Community Support. Mr. Hissick spoke to this earlier in this evening. My question and comment is with regards to grants and aid. Grants and aid is budgeted at $16,500. We know the actions we've taken over years in terms of moving ongoing requests and requests that ongoing requests that reach a larger magnitude. We've turned them into line item, moved them to line items, and that has left more room per se in the grants and aid budget. But we have not Mr. Hissick, can you recall when the last time we increased that grants and aid budget?
I can't recall for certain, but I want to say it was late in the term of the of 2 councils ago, like before you were back on council.
Thank you. And so I would like to give some consideration, and I realize this is kind of at the end of everything, but our experience has been through my previous term on council, and then of course those of us serving last term, that our funding requests are often 3 times, and that's a general estimate, 3 times the amount or more that we have in our grants and aid budget, and there is inflation, and I do appreciate that we've just moved possibly 10,000 out of the grants and aid, although we didn't allocate 10,000 from the grants and aid to those initiatives that we moved this year. They were lesser amounts. So I would just open it up for discussion rather than putting motion forward myself about the grants and aid budget, and if there's any comment from staff. Councillor O'Keefe. and then Councillor Duck.
I was just gonna say, my recollection in prior years is that, I think there was at least one occasion where we looked at the grants and aid budget, and we looked at what came in, and we made a decision to increase at the time, so I would, is that what you're
We
looking
increased,
to do?
we increased on a, I believe we increased on a one-off basis with COVID restart funds,
Right,
or twice. We
Mhm.
increased twice with COVID restart, so that's not ongoing, it's back to 16.5.
okay. No, I guess my point was that.
My suggestion is we give consideration to an ongoing increase.
So I think I just misunderstood what you said, but what I was suggesting is that when we get the grants and aids fund, we'll see what there's there, and we'll have an opportunity, would we not, to, if we wanna up it, we could do it at that time?
It would be a budget amendment. I'll turn to Mr. Hissig.
Well, there is some leeway to do a one-time increment through remaining safe restart, if that is council's wish. And then at that time, when grants are considered, that might be a time to refer to budget a potential increase for 2024. That could be one way to go.
You know, again, I'd rather make this, I'm looking to make this decision or give this consideration prior to us receiving the grants and aid application, and based on what we receive, than dickering or having a discussion about what the grants and aid budget should be. So I was gonna propose a modest increase to 20,000 for this year, and quite frankly, we can leave it to decide next year whether we want that to be ongoing. Councillor Duck?
I'd like to move and make a motion that we increase the grants and aid to 20,000 per annum.
Sorry, say the last part?
20,000 per annum.
Okay, so that's ongoing.
Second.
We have a mover and seconder. I won't motivate further. Councillor Duck?
No comment.
Councillor O'Keefe? Councillor O'Toole?
Thank you. Through the mayor to staff, what's the funding source for that?
That would be tax funded.
So I would like to know then what implication that has on the tax position for this year.
It would take the general tax increase from 4.54 to 4.57. So the residential would still be under 5, probably closer to 4.9, which was where we originally started.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe?
So grants and aid, so we can't take that from community amenity?
Sorry, if Councillor, it's an ongoing
Okay.
request, so it would go beyond, thank you. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? None opposed, the motion carries. Thank you. That concludes my questions and comments for this evening. Seeing no further, I would look for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you, council. Thank you, staff. Have a good evening.
Thanks.